In a world where the sky itself became the enemy and survival became the only currency worth trading, 5 individuals clawed their way out of the ashes of civilization and built something that should not have been possible: a network, a lifeline, and a legend. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I want to take a moment before we dive in to talk about why I made this video and how I put it together. I've been deep in Ark Raiders lore for a long time now, reading every environmental detail, listening to every piece of ambient dialogue, cross-referencing item descriptions, and faction notes. And I kept coming back to the traders. Everyone talks about the Ark themselves, about the machines, about the raids and the drops and the extraction points. But nobody was telling the full story of the 5 people sitting at those trade tables. Nobody was asking how they got there, what they lost to get there, and why they stay when every rational instinct should scream at them to run. So I made this video for the people who actually want to feel the world of Ark Raiders, not just play it. One specific choice I made when assembling this, I deliberately led with Celeste rather than opening on combat-focused traders like Shaunie or Tanwen, because I believe you cannot understand the economy of survival in this world without first understanding the person who decided that material things still had value when everything else had been taken. That choice shapes the entire video. So let's begin. Chapter 1. Celeste, the woman who decided ash was worth something. There is a particular kind of person who looks at a burned-out world and decides, quietly and without ceremony, that it can still be organized. Not saved. That word had been evacuated from the vocabulary of the underground long before Celeste arrived, but organized, catalogued, made useful. Celeste is that person. She is the materials trader, the one who deals in the raw substance of the world above, the steel pulled from collapsed towers, the composites salvaged from Ark wreckage, the rare earth elements that the machines left embedded in soil like seeds of a future nobody wanted to grow. But to understand why she is the one doing this, why she is the one who turned scavenging into a science and bartering into a language, you have to go back to before the Ark came. You have to go back to a woman who had everything and understood, with a precision that most people never develop, exactly what that meant. Because losing everything is catastrophic for most people. For Celeste, losing everything was educational. It taught her what things were actually worth when the artificial prices were stripped away. And that lesson, cold, clear, and acquired at enormous personal cost, is what made her indispensable in a world that had forgotten what indispensable felt like. Celeste was born in a mid-sized industrial city in a region that still had functioning supply chains, still had distribution networks, still had the kind of bureaucratic normalcy that most people find boring and some people find beautiful. She found it beautiful. Not in a sentimental way. Celeste has never been sentimental. Even as a child, she was suspicious of sentiment, aware that it was a feeling that made you overvalue things and undervalue other things in ways that inevitably led to bad decisions. She found it beautiful the way an engineer finds a well-designed bridge beautiful, as an expression of solved problems, of human thought made material and made functional. Her mother was a logistics coordinator for a large manufacturing firm. Her father was a geologist who spent 6 months of every year in the field and the other 6 months at a university desk writing papers that a few dozen specialists read and that nobody else cared about. Between the two of them, they gave her something rare: a deep understanding of where things came from and a deep understanding of where things went once they got there. The middle part, the part most people lived in, the stores and the deliveries and the products, that was the part everyone else understood. Celeste was always more interested in the edges. She studied material science at a university that no longer exists in a city, that no longer exists, and graduated at the top of her cohort with a dissertation on reclaimed alloy compositions that her thesis committee said was technically excellent but practically irrelevant. The practical relevance, she told one of those committee members years later, in what was perhaps the most ironic conversation of her life, turned out to be significant. She went to work for an extraction company, mineral extraction, the old-fashioned kind, pulling things from the earth in ways that were regulated and measured and priced on exchanges that reflected the collective judgment of thousands of investors about what those things were worth. She was good at her job. She was very good at her job, actually. And within a few years, she was managing teams, and within a few more years, she was overseeing operations at multiple sites simultaneously, and the extraction company's stock rose whenever she published her quarterly assessments, because her quarterly assessments were reliably accurate in a field where reliable accuracy was considered nearly impossible. She had a salary, she had an apartment, she had 2 cats, and a small collection of mineral samples that she kept on shelves in her home office. Not for decoration, but because she liked having the things themselves nearby when she read about them. She was, by any reasonable measure, thriving. The arc came on a Tuesday. She remembers the specific day not because Tuesday has any meaning, but because she had a meeting scheduled for that afternoon that she had been dreading for 3 weeks. A budget review that was going to involve a great deal of argument about projected extraction costs. And when the first reports came in of something descending through the atmosphere, she remembers her first conscious thought was a profound and slightly guilty relief that the meeting was probably going to be cancelled. That is the kind of thought a person has when the thing descending toward them is still abstract, still a news story, still something happening to other people in other places before it becomes something happening to you. By Wednesday, the meeting was not the issue. By Thursday, the city was not the same city. By the following Tuesday, she counted the days carefully. She has always counted carefully. The city was not a city at all. It was a process, a very fast, very loud, very hot process of subtraction. Celeste did not panic. This is not because she was brave in any dramatic sense. It is because panic, as she understood it, was a response to uncertainty about what to do next, and she almost always knew what to do next. The first thing she did was assess. She took stock of what she had in her apartment, what was in the building, what was on the street below, what was moving and what was not. She made a list. She has always made lists. The list told her exactly what she had, and what she had, while not much by the standards of a pre-arc world, was more than enough to begin. She packed with ruthless efficiency, discarding everything that could not be converted into use, and keeping everything that could. She left the cats with a neighbour who had a basement and a pantry, and who had more time to stay than Celeste did, and she went out into the altered city to find out what was left of it. What was left of it was, she would eventually calculate, approximately 31% of the pre-event infrastructure, depending on how you defined infrastructure and what you counted as still functional. The streets were passable in roughly half of their original length. 3 of the 6 main arteries into the city were either destroyed or blocked by arc constructs that showed no interest in conversation. The power grid was fractured but not entirely dead. Portions of it still hummed in the underground sections, fed by generators that the arc had not yet located or had not yet decided to destroy. And Celeste made careful note of where those sections were, because power was the first resource that everything else depended on. Food was a problem, but not an immediate one. The city's warehouses were intact at a higher rate than the residential areas, possibly because the arc's initial targeting logic prioritized communications and transit infrastructure. And she knew where those warehouses were because she had studied logistics networks the way other people studied weather patterns. She could read a city's supply chain the way a navigator reads a coastline, knowing by intuition and experience where the deep stores were, where the redundancies lived, where the emergency reserves that no ordinary citizen ever thought about were quietly waiting to be found. She spent the first 3 weeks doing something that looked insane to the people who observed it. She walked. She walked through the damaged city in widening circles, always with a pack, always with a notebook. She had found a waterproof one in a stationer's shop that the arc had mostly ignored, and she wrote down everything she saw, not in the breathless, terrified way of someone trying to document a disaster for posterity, but in the dry, technical way of a professional cataloguing an inventory. Column 1, location. Column 2, material type. Column 3, estimated quantity. Column 4, accessibility rating, from 1 to 5 based on how much effort and risk extraction would require. Column 5, estimated post-processing value, which is to say, what you could make from it, what you could trade it for, what purpose it might serve in a world where the old purposes no longer applied, and new ones were being invented daily. Nobody had asked her to do this. There was no organization employing her, no company paying her salary, no committee reviewing her assessments. She did it because it needed to be done, and because she was the person who could do it, and because in a very deep place in her character, she believed that understanding what was there was the prerequisite for everything else. Word got around, the way it always does in collapsed situations, through whisper networks and chance encounters and the particular gravity that capable people exert on the desperate. Someone found her on her walks. A young man who had been trying to organize a group of survivors in the basement of the sports complex, 3 blocks from one of the big warehouses she had already mapped, who had heard from someone that there was a woman who knew where things were. He was young and earnest, and not particularly strategic, and Celeste could see immediately that his group was going to run out of food in approximately 16 days if nothing changed, because they were consuming reserves without any systematic thought about replenishment. She told him this. She also told him exactly where to find the warehouse, what route to take to minimize exposure to Ark patrol patterns she had already mapped, what containers in the warehouse were likely to hold preserved food as opposed to industrial supplies, and what to bring to carry it back efficiently. He stared at her as though she were a ghost, or a god, or some new category of thing that did not have a name yet. She told him she was none of those things, and that he needed to leave by dawn if he wanted to hit the patrol gap she had identified. His group survived. And then they sent someone back to her, and then someone else sent someone. And then Celeste understood, with the same clarity that had always characterized her understanding of supply networks, that she had become a node. In logistics, a node is a point in a network through which information and resources pass. Not a terminal, not an origin, not a destination, but a through point, a hub, a place that everything connects to because of its position and its function. She had not planned to become a node. She had been simply doing what she did. But here she was, with people coming to her to find out what existed and where it was, and how to get to it and what it was worth. And she had the answers, because she had walked the circles and filled the notebooks. And that meant she was the node, whether she had chosen it or not. She chose it. She decided in the deliberate, organized way that she decided everything, that this was what she was going to do, and that she was going to do it properly. The concept of trade, real trade, systematic trade, value for value exchange rather than begging or taking, was not obvious in those early days. Most survivor groups operated on a kind of desperate communalism that was noble in intention and deeply inefficient in practice. You shared what you had, you pooled what you found, you distributed according to need. And it worked until it didn't, which was usually when the resources were thin enough that sharing them equally meant nobody had enough. Celeste had read enough history to know this pattern. She had also read enough economics to know what replaced it when pure communalism broke down, and she was not going to wait for the breakdown before introducing the replacement. She began, carefully and without fanfare, to propose exchanges. Not demands, not ultimatums, exchanges. You bring me this, I will tell you where to find that. You provide labor for this extraction, I will provide a portion of what is extracted. You trade me this material, which you cannot use, for this information, which will let you obtain what you actually need. She made the exchanges fair, ruthlessly, almost aggressively fair, because she understood that a trade system would only sustain itself if the participants believed it was fair, and she also simply believed it was the right approach in a moral sense, which was a consideration she would never have stated out loud in those early days, but which was present nonetheless. The materials network grew. It grew in the way that genuinely functional things grow, not with dramatic announcements or formal founding moments, but through accumulation, through each exchange leading to another, through reputation building on itself until Celeste's knowledge of what was available and where it was constituted a form of power, more durable than weapons or numbers. She had competitors, of course, other people who tried to set up their own exchange systems, who tried to map their own territories, who tried to accumulate their own information. Some of them were clever. Some of them were well supplied. A few of them understood logistics in a technical sense. None of them had her combination of raw analytical capability, systematic methodology, and what she would reluctantly, in her most honest moments, describe as an ethical commitment to making the system work for the people inside it, rather than primarily for herself. That last part, she knew, was unusual. Power structures in post-collapse environments tended toward the extractive. She was in the extraction business after all, but she extracted from the environment, not from the people. That distinction turned out to matter enormously. There came a point, some months into the collapse, when Celeste was approached by a representative of something larger. The underground networks were beginning to consolidate. Not politically, not yet, but practically, because isolated groups kept running into the same logistical problems that interconnection could solve, and the people who were paying attention to those problems were coming to the same conclusion independently. Someone was assembling the beginnings of what would eventually become the Ark Raiders hub, not yet formalized, not yet named, but taking shape in the spaces between groups and in the conversations between people who were tired of every problem being solved from scratch. The representative who found Celeste was a woman who introduced herself with a first name only, and who had the eyes of someone who had made several very difficult decisions and had not been destroyed by them, which Celeste found reassuring in a way she could not immediately articulate. They talked for 4 hours. Celeste asked more questions than she answered. At the end, the representative told her that the emerging collective needed a materials coordinator, someone who could manage the flow of physical resources, assess what was available in the surface zones, and establish a viable exchange infrastructure for the raiders who were going to be sent topside. Celeste asked what the compensation structure was. The representative smiled and said that was exactly the right question and that she was exactly the right person. The transition to what she eventually became, the materials trader at the hub, the person everyone knew as the one to see about raw goods and components and what the surface could yield, was not instantaneous. There was a period of construction that was as much organizational as physical, where she was simultaneously learning the specific conditions of her new role, teaching the systems she had developed to the people who would need to use them, and continuing to do the actual analytical work that made those systems meaningful. She set up her first proper trading post in a repurposed mechanical room that smelled of oil and old metal and had excellent structural integrity relative to its surroundings, which she had verified personally before agreeing to use it. She arranged her first real inventory, physical samples of the materials she tracked, catalogued by type and grade and availability, displayed not for aesthetic reasons but for practical ones. A raider who could see what they were bringing back before they went out was a raider who made better decisions about what to prioritize. She wrote her first formal rate tables, posting them with the same methodical clarity as scientific data, because she believed people deserved to understand exactly what their effort was worth before they committed it. The raiders came, at first tentatively, skeptically, in the way that people approach anything new when they have been burned by new things before, then more regularly, then with the casual familiarity of people who have found a reliable part of their world in a world where reliability was rare. Celeste learned their names. She made a point of learning names, not because she was warm in any conventional sense, but because she believed that a functional exchange system required participants who trusted the system. And trust in the system was built in part through the recognition that the system's administrator actually saw them as individuals, rather than transaction events. She was not their friend. She did not pretend to be, but she was consistent, and she was fair, and she was almost never wrong about what something was worth. And in the long run, those qualities built something deeper than friendship. They built confidence. The confidence that when you came to Celeste with what you had found on the surface, you would receive an accurate assessment and a fair exchange every single time, without variation, without favoritism, without the subtle erosions that corrupt most systems eventually. She did not merely accept materials, she transformed them, not physically, but categorically. She had a gift for seeing what a thing could be beyond what it was, a piece of arc wreckage that a raider brought in as scrap metal. Celeste would examine and identify as a specific alloy with specific tensile properties, useful for specific fabrication purposes, assigning it a value 20 times what the raider had imagined. A handful of soil samples, brought back almost as an afterthought from a particular zone, Celeste would analyze and identify as containing trace deposits of rare earth elements that shifted the entire understanding of what that zone's value was. She turned the surface from a place of danger into a place of discernible, mappable, tradable value, and that transformation was perhaps her most significant contribution to the survival of the underground collective. More significant than any specific trade, more significant than any individual discovery, she changed the frame. She made the world above into a resource rather than merely a threat. And once you could see it that way, you could think about it differently. And once you could think about it differently, you could survive it more systematically. Her relationship with the other traders developed over time in ways that are characteristic of professional respect in constrained environments. Quietly, without ceremony, through the accumulation of interactions that revealed character. She and Shaunie came to an understanding early that was less friendship than mutual recognition. Both women understood systems, both women had an unsentimental approach to value, and both women had made hard choices that less capable people would have found paralyzing. They did not socialize, they did not confide, but when Celeste needed security assessments for surface zones she was considering adding to her resource maps, Shaunie provided them with the same level of detail and reliability that Celeste provided in her material assessments. And that consistency was its own form of communication. With Tanwen, the relationship was more technically collaborative. They shared an interest in the material composition of ARC systems, she from a recovery perspective and he from a weaponization perspective. And their overlapping curiosity produced several joint assessments that improved both of their domains significantly. Apollo she found puzzling in the way that she found most genuinely creative thinkers puzzling. She could follow his logic, but not his leaps, which she suspected was a limitation of her own thinking rather than a flaw in his. Lance she respected with something close to warmth, which for Celeste was the closest approximation of warmth she had available. He shared her commitment to the functional over the sentimental. And yet there was something in his particular application of that commitment, the way he directed it specifically toward keeping people alive, that she found quietly moving. The materials she valued most were not the rarest. This surprised people when they first learned it. They expected her to have a reverence for the exotic, for the unique deposits and the anomalous alloys, and the one-of-a-kind finds that raiders occasionally brought up from the deepest surface zones. And she did value those things, accurately and precisely. But the materials she most prized in some deeper sense were the reliable ones, the consistent deposits, the predictable grades, the alloys that always behaved the way their composition predicted, because reliability was what made a system functional, and function was what made survival possible. And survival was the entire point. Rarity was interesting. Reliability was essential. She had the same view of people. Her notebooks from those early years were eventually transferred to the hub's central archive, where they occupy several sealed cases and are treated with a reverence that Celeste finds somewhat embarrassing when she thinks about it. They are not historical documents, she has said, on at least one recorded occasion. They are field notes, and the appropriate response to field notes is to update them when they become outdated, not to preserve them as though they were sacred. But the archivist who made the decision to preserve them argued, successfully, that the methodology they demonstrated was as important as the information they contained, and that future generations of surface mappers would benefit from studying not just what Celeste had found, but how she had looked for it. Celeste, in the end, did not object. Objecting to well-reasoned arguments was something she was constitutionally incapable of doing, no matter who made them. She expanded her network constantly. The surface zones that raiders operated in changed. New areas opened as ARC activity shifted. Old areas became inaccessible as ARC constructs consolidated their presence. And the value of what could be extracted from any given location was always in flux relative to what was needed in the hub. Celeste tracked all of it. She developed a notation system for decay rates of various material types in surface conditions, how quickly certain composites degraded under arc energy exposure, how long specific alloys remained viable after being cut from their original structures, how environmental factors affected the practical yield of a given extraction. This was not information that anyone had asked for. It was information she determined was necessary and therefore produced. This pattern, seeing what was needed, producing it without being asked, making it available, is the through line of her entire career and perhaps the through line of her character. She does not wait to be told what to do. She assesses, decides, and acts. Then she offers the results to whoever can use them. The question of what Celeste wants, not professionally, but personally, in the private space that her professional persona keeps carefully partitioned from public view, is one that most people at the hub have eventually wondered about. She works constantly. She maintains her inventory with a precision that goes well beyond what efficiency requires. She rarely leaves the trading post during active raiding periods, though she has occasionally been seen on the surface during low-activity windows, always with a field kit, always taking samples, always with the notebook. There are a few people who have known her long enough to notice that she takes particular care of certain raiders, not in any overt way, not with preferential rates or special treatment, but in the way she assigns specific zones to specific extraction requests, sometimes steering people she has quietly assessed as less experienced toward areas she has quietly assessed as lower risk. In ways that look like coincidence, but never quite are. She would deny this if asked directly. She would say she is simply matching extraction capability to extraction difficulty for efficiency reasons, which is also true, but is not the only truth. One of the most revealing moments in Celeste's documented history occurred during a period when ARC activity spiked dramatically in the northern surface zones, cutting off access to two of the hub's most productive material sources simultaneously. The immediate response from most of the hub's logistical planners was alarm. The supply deficit was significant, and the timeline for resolution was unclear. Celeste had already begun mapping alternative sources before the alarm reached its peak, not because she was prescient, but because she had been monitoring the activity patterns that preceded the spike for weeks and had quietly prepared contingency assessments for exactly this scenario. When she presented them, calmly, in her characteristic format of organized data, followed by a short interpretive summary and a practical recommendation, the silence in the room was not stunned so much as recalibrating, everyone adjusting their internal model of Celeste upward by another increment. She told them afterward, in response to a comment about her apparent foresight, that it was not foresight, it was maintenance of situational awareness. She said foresight implied something extraordinary. What she had done was simply her job. The materials she handled were not just functional. They told stories, though Celeste herself would not use that word. Every piece of ARC wreckage carried information about the machine it had come from, about the encounter that had destroyed it, about the zone it had occupied, and the processes it had been involved in. Every composite alloy scraped from a collapsed building spoke of the building's original function, its construction period, its structural logic. A geologist reads landscape as narrative. Her father had taught her that, almost without meaning to, through 1,000 small observations he made aloud on their occasional walks together when she was a child. She had internalized it not as romance, but as method. She read materials the way her father had read rocks, as records, as evidence, as information encoded in physical form. And the information they contained, properly decoded, made the system she was building more and more accurate, more and more capable of serving the people who depended on it. She had rules. She had a small number of hard rules that she never bent, and a larger number of soft guidelines that she adjusted regularly based on evidence. The hard rules were few but absolute. She would not knowingly overvalue materials to deceive a raider into a bad exchange. She would not withhold information about hazards in zones she was mapping if that information was relevant to someone's safety. She would not facilitate the acquisition of materials she had reason to believe would be used to harm the people she served. These rules had cost her, in the narrow economic sense. On several occasions, there had been offers, from individuals and from groups, to pay premium rates for materials or information in contexts that would have required her to violate one of the three. She had declined every time with the same flat, unapologetic clarity with which she declined everything she was not going to do. The people who made those offers generally understood, on reflection, that this was both her limitation and her strength, and that the strength was the reason they had come to her in the first place. Her approach to ARC materials specifically, the wreckage and components from the machines themselves, rather than from human structures, evolved significantly over the years. In the early period, ARC debris was treated primarily as a nuisance, a contaminant in the salvage field that complicated extraction without obvious compensating value. Celeste was among the first to systematically study its composition and to argue, with evidence, that certain arc alloys and components had material properties that human manufacturing had never achieved, and that understanding those properties was the prerequisite for potentially replicating or adapting them. This was a long-horizon argument. The replication timeline was speculative and distant, but it shifted the way arc wreckage was treated in the hub, from something to be worked around to something to be collected and analyzed. The practical dividends of this shift accumulated slowly, and then, as these things tend to do, all at once. One of the quieter aspects of Celeste's role is her function as a kind of historian of the surface. The zones change, arc activity reshapes them, weather systems affect them, other raiders alter them through extraction and the occasional destructive encounter, and the change is continuous and not always legible in the moment. But Celeste has been tracking the surface long enough that she has a longitudinal record no one else possesses. She can tell you what a given zone looked like 3 years ago, what its material profile was, what has been taken from it, and what has appeared in it, how the arc presence has evolved. This history is practical. It informs predictions about future availability and risk, but it is also, in an oblique way, something else. It is the only kind of memorial the surface has. Nobody is going up there to plant markers or maintain records of what was lost. But Celeste's notebooks, with their dry columns and their systematic assessments, contain within them an implicit record of everything the above world used to be and is no longer. She has never spoken about this directly. She does not need to. Her trading post is organized in a way that reflects her mind, ordered, logical, cross-referenced, with a place for everything and an explicit system for everything. Raiders who are new to the hub often find it intimidating, not because Celeste is unfriendly, but because the density of organization implies a standard of preparation that they worry they cannot meet. Veterans know better. They know that the intimidating organization exists not to exclude people but to serve them, that the reason everything is labeled and measured and catalogued is precisely so that a person who walks in with something they've found and are not sure about can get an accurate, honest assessment in the shortest possible time with the least possible uncertainty. The organization is for them, not for her. She built the system for the people who would use it, and the people who come to understand that, which is almost everyone, eventually, come to understand something essential about her. She is not beloved in the way that certain other figures in the hub are beloved. She does not have the kind of warm, immediately accessible charisma that turns people into followers, and she has never sought it. What she has is something more durable. She has the reputation of someone who is always right and always fair. And in a world where being wrong about something can mean not coming home, and being cheated about something can mean not surviving the winter, always right and always fair is worth more than beloved. People trust Celeste the way they trust gravity, not with warmth, not with gratitude necessarily, but with the bedrock certainty that it will be there and that it will behave the way it behaves. She is, in the most fundamental sense of the word, reliable. And reliability, as she has always known, is essential. The materials she loves, and love is a word she would not use, but that is the functional concept, are the ones that do multiple jobs. Alloys with high strength to weight ratios that can be used in both structural and tool applications. Compounds with thermal resistance and conductive properties that serve both shielding and energy management purposes. Materials that are what engineers call versatile, meaning they solve more than one problem, meaning their value is multiplicative rather than additive. She has an aesthetic response to this kind of material, though she would describe it as an analytical appreciation rather than an aesthetic one. When she holds a piece of salvage that she has identified as high versatility, there is something in her expression, a slight, almost invisible shift in the set of her face that the people who know her well have learned to read as satisfaction. Not excitement, not joy, satisfaction. The particular, settled feeling of a thing being what it is supposed to be. The traders who came after her, not chronologically, but in the sense of joining the hub's ecosystem of exchange, found in Celeste a model whether they acknowledged it or not. The way she structured her trade rates, the transparency of her pricing logic, the documentation she maintained, these set a standard that shaped what trading at the hub meant. Shaunie's weapon rates and Tanwen's ammunition pricing follow structural logics that bear Celeste's fingerprints even where they are not derived from her directly, because she was first, and first shapes what comes after. Apollo's gadget exchanges, which have an improvisational quality that might seem at odds with Celeste's systematic approach, are in fact built on infrastructure she established. The assessment protocols, the material categorization system, the exchange documentation that allowed his creativity to function in a reliable environment. Even Lance's medical supply trade, which operates on different moral logics than the others, observes the formal fairness principles she established without compromise. She thinks about waste constantly, not in the anxious way of someone worried about not having enough, but in the analytical way of someone who sees waste as a design failure, as evidence that a system is not optimized, not extracting full value from its inputs, not converting potential into use at the rate it could. The surface is full of potential. Celeste sees it more clearly than anyone, and every piece of that potential that is left to degrade without extraction and application is not merely a missed opportunity, but a kind of structural failure, a gap between what the system could do and what it is doing. She works continuously and without fanfare to close that gap. Every new material source mapped, every improved assessment protocol developed, every raider better briefed before going topside is a reduction of waste, an optimization, a step toward the version of the system that is performing as close to its theoretical maximum as the conditions allow. She will never reach that maximum. She knows that. She is moving toward it anyway. She has never talked about what she lost in the early period of the Ark descent. She has never mentioned whether there were people she was unable to save, whether the cat survived, whether the neighbor with the basement made it. The notebooks begin on a specific date and do not contain personal entries before the first field assessment. Whatever happened before that entry, whatever the space between the apartment and the first circle of walking contained, is not recorded. People have speculated. She has not confirmed or denied anything. It does not require confirmation or denial. What it requires, if it requires anything, is the understanding that a person who converts everything into method does so for a reason, and that the reason is usually that the uncontrolled version of things became too large to hold. The organized system is not a cage. It is a frame that makes the large things manageable. She built her frame from raw materials. Like everything else, like everything she does, she ages at the hub with the same quality she has always had, consistently. She does not change dramatically. She does not have episodes or crises or visible transformations. She is more or less the same person from week to week and year to year. The same precision, the same fairness, the same dry, accurate manner of speaking about value. If she has grown, it is in the kinds of growth that are invisible from outside. A slightly deeper capacity for patience with people who are new to the system, a slightly more developed ability to read a raider's situation from context rather than explicit statement, a slightly broader map in her head of the web of dependencies that makes the hub function. She is still moving toward the theoretical maximum. She is still keeping the notebooks. She is still the node. Her contribution to the hub cannot be quantified in any single ledger, which she would find both accurate and somewhat amusing if it were pointed out to her. The entire economy of Ark raiders, the material flows, the exchange rates, the way value is assessed and distributed and used, bears her architecture at its foundation. Everything that is traded at the hub, whether by her or by the others, moves through systems she established or influenced. The weapons Shaunie sells were located partly through surface maps Celeste compiled. The ammunition Tanwen stocks depends on raw material assessments Celeste provided. The components in Apollo's gadgets trace back to extraction priorities she identified. The medical supplies Lance trades were partly sourced through exchange networks she built. She is not the hub, but she is in the hub, the way the frame is in a building, invisible from inside when everything is working, essential the moment anything is not. There is a raider, one of the senior ones, who has traded with Celeste for several years, and who, when asked about her, says simply, "She never lied to me about what something was worth." He says it with the particular tone of someone describing a rarity. Not unusual, but genuinely unusual, in the same register as describing someone who has never broken a promise or never taken more than their share. In the world of Ark raiders, In the underground world of people who are all fighting for their portion of a diminished supply, the person who never lies about what something is worth is not common. It is, when you find it, the kind of thing you do not forget. And the reason he comes back to trade, the reason they all come back, is not habit or convenience. It is the knowledge that the assessment will be accurate and the exchange will be fair, every time, without exception, until the end of whatever this is. Celeste keeps a single personal object at her trading post that does not serve a functional purpose. It is a small piece of unclassified mineral, not from the surface zones, not categorized in any of her systems. It is a piece of rock she picked up from the ground on the first day of her first circle walk, before she had filled a single column of the first notebook, when the city was still burning and the ark was still moving, and the world was still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to be. She does not display it. It sits in the corner of the lower shelf, behind the main counter, behind several canisters of classified alloy samples, not hidden, but not visible without specific looking. She has never explained it, and nobody has asked. It is not a memorial. It is not a talisman. It is the first piece of the world she assessed after everything changed. The thing she picked up before she knew what she was going to become, before the system existed, before the notebooks. It is the before. She keeps the before close, not to mourn it and not to forget it, just to know it is there. Chapter 2. Shaunie, the soldier who never stopped soldiering. If Celeste represents the mind of the hub's trading network, Shaunie represents something closer to its spine, the structural element that holds everything upright, the thing you don't think about unless it fails, the thing whose absence you would feel before you understood what was missing. She is the security and weapons trader, the one who deals in the means of force, the firearms, the defensive equipment, the tactical intelligence about what you're going to face on the surface and how best to survive it. But that description, accurate as far as it goes, misses the essential character of what she actually does, which is not commerce in violence, but rather commerce in survival probability. Shaunie does not sell weapons. She sells the gap between coming home and not coming home, and she is deeply, soberly serious about the distinction. To understand why, you have to understand what she was before, which is to say, you have to understand what it means to spend years watching people not come home and believing, with the conviction of someone who has lived inside the logic of it, that the outcome was preventable if only the preparation had been right. Shaunie grew up in what she once described, in the only extended personal statement she has ever made on record, as a place where the options were limited, but the principles were not. This is the kind of statement that sounds almost like a proverb until you spend time with it, and then it starts to feel like the most accurate description of a specific kind of upbringing, the kind where material resources are scarce and moral resources are deliberately cultivated as a compensating investment. Her family was military, not in the sense of a family that had a few members who served, but in the generational sense of a family whose identity was organized around service, whose stories were about service, whose sense of what it meant to be a person was built on the substrate of duty and discipline. Her grandmother had served, her mother had served, 2 of her uncles had served, one of them twice, and in 2 different services. The expectation that Shaunie would serve was not articulated as an expectation, because it did not need to be. It was simply the shape of the future as she understood it, the default path that she would need a specific reason to depart from. She never found a reason. She enlisted at 18, as close to the legal threshold as the processing time allowed, and she was assigned to an infantry unit in a region that was strategically significant and practically difficult. The region was significant because it sat at the intersection of 3 competing interests, none of which she was deeply invested in, because infantry soldiers in complex political situations are rarely given the luxury of deep investment in the political dimensions of their work. And it was difficult because the terrain was uneven, the locals were unsympathetic to all 3 competing interests including hers, and the operational parameters shifted with a frequency that made planning nearly impossible. She was good at this. She was very good at this, in the specific way that people who are good at difficult things under conditions of uncertainty are good, not by being better than the problem, but by being better at adapting to the problem's continuous changes. She learned rapidly. She processed tactical information in ways her unit commanders noticed and then documented. because documenting unusual capability is what unit commanders do when they want to keep the paperwork trail clear in case the unusual capability needs to be promoted or transferred. She was promoted. She was transferred. She did this several times until she was in a role that was more advisory than operational, which she found less satisfying in some ways and more consequential in others. The advisory role put her in front of people making decisions, and the experience of watching decisions being made by people with full information sets versus people with incomplete information sets, by people who had been trained to think under pressure versus people who had been given power without that training, was formative in a way she did not immediately recognize, but eventually could not deny. She saw the consequences of bad decisions in the most direct possible way. In the subsequent after-action reports, in the casualty numbers, in the faces of people who had followed orders into situations that better prepared decision-making would not have created. She began to develop a framework, not consciously at first, and then with increasing deliberateness, for the relationship between information quality and survival probability. She was not a philosopher, and she did not frame it in those terms. She framed it in the terms of her profession. Mission preparation is the primary determinant of mission outcome. Everything else is adjustment. You cannot adjust your way out of bad preparation. You can only die, more interestingly. This framework, which is not a philosophy in the abstract sense, but a practical operating principle derived from observation, is the core of what she brought to the hub and what she embeds in every transaction she makes as a weapons trader. When she sells a weapon to a raider, she does not simply transfer the object and record the exchange. She asks where they are going. She asks what they expect to encounter. She asks what their current loadout is and what their extraction plan looks like, and what their backup plan looks like if the extraction plan fails. Not all traders ask these questions. Most traders are in the business of exchange, not interrogation. Shaunie does not distinguish between the two, because in her framework, the information exchange is part of the transaction, a component of the survival probability gap that she is selling, as essential as the weapon itself. A raider who buys a weapon without understanding how to deploy it in the specific conditions they are about to enter has not improved their survival probability by the amount they think they have. Shaunie's job, as she understands it, is to close the gap between perceived preparation and actual preparation. She arrived at the hub not because it was recruited to her, but because she found it. She had been operating independently in the surface zones after the arc descended, not as a raider in the current organized sense, but as a solitary operative doing what she had always done: assessing threats, mapping movements, identifying vulnerabilities in an enemy force that was unlike anything she had trained against, but that still had a structure, still had patterns, still had the fundamental characteristic of any organized force, which is that it moves in predictable ways if you watch it long enough. She had been watching it for months by the time she encountered the first organized raiding groups, and her immediate reaction to those groups was the same reaction she had always had to poorly prepared units, a mixture of professional concern and the specific form of impatience that comes from seeing preventable mistakes being made by people who are about to pay for them. She began, without formally announcing herself, to leave information in places where those groups would find it. Notes at first, detailed tactical assessments of specific zones, written in the compressed, abbreviation-heavy format of professional military communication, and therefore initially difficult for non-military recipients to interpret. Then she adapted. The information got clearer. The response, people surviving encounters that should have killed them, and attributing the survival to the information they had found, was detectable even from her distance. When she eventually made direct contact with the Proto-Hub collective, the conversation was characteristically Shaunie: efficient, organized, oriented entirely toward the practical. She did not talk about her background. She did not make arguments for her value. She presented, in approximately 20 minutes of focused presentation, a tactical analysis of the 3 highest priority surface zones the collective was using, identified 7 specific vulnerabilities in their operational security, proposed concrete mitigations for each, and then waited to see if the people in front of her were the kind of people who responded to evidence or the kind of people who responded to personality. They responded to evidence. That told her enough. she agreed to a role. The role was officially security coordination, but it became, as these things do, what she made it. Her trading post is organized on a principle that is different from Celeste's, but equally rigorous. It is organized by function and scenario rather than by material type. The weapons are not sorted by caliber or manufacture or quality in the conventional sense. They are sorted by application, by what you are going to face, by what you need to do, by the specific combination of distance and target type and environmental condition that the weapon is optimized for. A raider who walks into Shaunie's post and says they need a weapon is going to be asked a series of questions before they see any inventory, because the inventory is meaningless without the context of application. This frustrates some people, particularly newer raiders who feel that they know what they want and resent the interrogation. Veterans find it different. Veterans have had the experience of going out with the wrong weapon for the conditions and of surviving it, or of knowing someone who didn't. And they come to understand that the questions are not obstacles, they are part of the product. She knows every weapon she stocks to a level of detail that goes beyond what any retail transaction requires. She knows their mechanical history, their performance patterns, their failure modes, their particular quirks under the specific conditions of the surface zones. She can tell you which weapons perform better in high particulate environments, which are more reliable when wet, which have the most forgiving tolerance windows when maintenance is irregular, which it always is in the field, because field maintenance is never perfect, and the weapons that are most tolerant of imperfect maintenance are the weapons that are most likely to perform when they most need to. She assembled this knowledge the way all of her knowledge was assembled, by watching, by testing, by recording, and by caring about the outcome in the particular way she has always cared, which is that the outcome is someone living or dying, and she is not indifferent to that. The security aspect of her role extends well beyond the trading post. She is the person responsible for the hub's threat assessment protocols, the ongoing analysis of ARC activity patterns, the identification of zones that are becoming more or less dangerous, the early warning systems that alert the collective to shifts in ARC operational behavior that might affect raider safety. She does this work in addition to the trading work, not because it is formally her responsibility, but because she is constitutionally incapable of not doing it. She cannot be in a position of having information that might prevent a death and not sharing it, even when sharing it is inconvenient, even when the information is uncertain rather than confirmed. She errs toward disclosure of threat information in the same way that Celeste errs toward disclosure of material information, on the grounds that people deserve to make their own informed decisions and that withholding information from them, even with protective intent, is a form of disrespect that she is not willing to practice. Her relationship with the Ark as an adversary is complex in ways she would not describe as complex, because she does not use words like complex to describe her professional relationships. But it is observable. She studies the Ark with the concentrated attention that she has always given to adversaries, not with hatred, which she has always considered a tactical handicap, but with the focused, persistent, analytical attention of someone who understands that the adversary is the most important variable in the equation. She reads ARC behavior the way she has always read enemy behavior, as a system with logic, with patterns, with characteristics that can be understood and therefore anticipated. She does not hate them. She does not personalize them. She finds them formidable, which she considers the most accurate available description and the most professionally relevant one. Some of her most important contributions to raider survival have not been weapons but information. Specifically, the tactical briefs she provides to outgoing raid groups when she determines that a particular zone or time window presents unusual risk. These briefs are not formally required. They are an addition to the standard exchange that she provides when she judges them necessary. A raider picking up a weapon before going into a zone Shaunie has assessed as newly elevated risk will receive, along with the weapon, a precise, concise briefing on what has changed, what specific behaviors to expect, and what adjustments to standard procedure are recommended. She delivers these briefs in the same tone she uses for everything else: flat, direct, information-dense, without editorializing, and the raiders receive them in the same way, with the attentiveness of people who understand that this woman knows something important about the difference between returning and not returning. She has lost people. This is a fact that she would confirm without hesitation if asked, and that she would not discuss in any further detail. She has lost raiders who came to her for weapons and information, and went out with both and did not come back, and the number of those people has accumulated over the years into something significant. She does not perform grief. She does not have rituals of mourning that others have observed. What she has, and this is the observation of several people who have known her for long enough, is an incremental tightening of the precision with which she does her work. Each time someone does not return, she identifies, where possible, the specific failure in the causal chain that contributed to the outcome, and she addresses it. She updates her tactical assessments. She revises her briefing protocols. She adds questions to the pre-trade interrogation that would have caught the specific gap. She does not do this because she believes she can prevent all deaths. She does it because she believes she can prevent some, and some is worth doing. Her weapons are not just sold, they are matched, and the matching process is one of the most specific forms of expertise at the hub. She has developed a profiling methodology for raider capability assessment that is informal in its execution, but rigorous in its logic. From the way a person holds a weapon during inspection, the questions they ask and don't ask, their knowledge of their own previous surface encounters, their physical conditioning, and their stated and unstated risk tolerance, she constructs a picture of what they are actually capable of deploying versus what they believe they are capable of deploying. The gap between those two things is where most accidents live. Her job, in the matching process, is to recommend weapons that the raider can actually use effectively, rather than weapons that are technically superior but operationally beyond the raider's current capability. This is not always a comfortable conversation. People tend to want the best available, and explaining to someone that the best available for someone else might not be the best available for them requires a particular kind of tactfulness that does not come naturally to Shaunie, but that she has developed because the alternative, people dying because they were sold capability they couldn't execute, is unacceptable. She trains. Not the raiders, not formally. She has helped with training exercises when specifically asked, and has occasionally provided individual coaching to people she judged were in need of it. But formal training is not her role, and she is clear about the boundaries of her role. She trains herself, continuously, in the way that professional soldiers never fully stop training. In the dry fire drills she runs in her off hours, the tactical problem-solving exercises she runs in her head during quiet periods, the weapon disassembly and reassembly routines she maintains, even for weapons she knows intimately, because knowing a weapon intimately is what you get from maintaining the practice of knowing it, and the practice is not optional. She has not been in a conventional combat situation since the early post-ARC period, but she carries herself as though she might be in one at any moment. Not from anxiety, but from professional disposition. The disposition is its own form of preparation. She cannot not be prepared, any more than Celeste can not be organized. It is the structure of who she is. There is a story, unverified, possibly apocryphal, but consistent with what people know of her, about an early incident in the hub when a larger group attempted to negotiate with the collective from a position of implied threat, suggesting that the collective security arrangements were insufficient to prevent them from simply taking what they wanted. The person they chose to make this suggestion to, in the room where this negotiation took place, was Shaunie. She listened to the entire statement without interrupting. Then she described, in the same flat, organized manner she uses for everything, the exact number of defensive positions that had been prepared before the meeting, the specific identities of the people holding those positions, the specific weapons they were carrying, and the specific arcs of coverage those weapons provided, and the timeline that she had estimated for the negotiating group to reach any of the exits if they chose to test the assessment empirically. The negotiating group reassessed their position. The negotiation concluded without incident. She has a particular interest in arc-derived weapons components, the pieces of machine technology that can be repurposed into human weapon systems, either directly or as materials for fabrication. This interest intersects with Celeste's material tracking work and with Tanwen's ammunition expertise, and the three of them have an informal collaboration on arc weapons technology that is not formally documented, but that everyone at the hub knows exists, and that has produced several significant advances in raider combat capability. Shaunie's contribution to this collaboration is the operational assessment side. She tests things in controlled conditions she establishes herself, and reports what works and what doesn't, and under what specific conditions. And her reports have a reliability and a specificity that the others have come to rely on as ground truth in a field where ground truth is difficult to establish. The defensive equipment she stocks is as carefully curated as the weapons. She has strong opinions about protection, not in the generalized sense of preferring more to less, but in the specific sense of understanding that protection is a trade-off with mobility, and that both matter, and that the optimal point on the trade-off curve is different for different raiders and different missions. She will not sell someone armor that she has assessed as wrong for their use case, even if they want it. She will explain why it is wrong, she will describe what would be right, and she will provide what is right, if she has it. If she does not have it, she will tell them what to look for on the surface to source it. This is the Shaunie version of customer service: comprehensive, accurate, and completely indifferent to the customer's momentary preferences when those preferences conflict with their survival requirements. Her post-arc view of the world's political and social structures, the ones that used to exist, the ones that are forming now underground, is pragmatic in a way that might be mistaken for cynicism. She does not believe that the old structures should be restored, not because she thought they were bad, but because she thinks restoration of exactly what was is generally impossible, and the attempt wastes resources better spent on building what should be. She also does not believe that the underground collective is the permanent answer. She thinks it is a functional response to current conditions. And when conditions change sufficiently, the functional response will need to change as well. She is not attached to forms, only to functions. As long as the function, people surviving who would otherwise not, is being served, the form that serves it is the right form. This is not apathy. It is the pragmatism of someone who has watched forms collapse and functions persist, and who has drawn the obvious conclusion about which one deserves allegiance. She respects Celeste because Celeste is right about the things she is right about and does not pretend to be right about the things she is not right about. She works with Tanwen because his technical knowledge fills gaps in hers and vice versa, and the collaboration produces better outcomes than either of them working separately. She finds Apollo legitimately interesting, which surprises her occasionally. She did not expect to find anyone legitimately interesting, and the fact that he regularly approaches problems in ways she had not considered, and that sometimes turn out to be better ways, is an experience she has concluded is valuable, even though it is occasionally irritating. Lance she watches with something that she would not call concern, but that functions like concern. She is aware that his role requires a different kind of engagement with human suffering than hers, and she respects the stability he maintains in the face of that engagement, though she sometimes wonders what it costs him in the quiet hours. She has never told anyone what she is afraid of. This is not because she is without fear. She has been afraid many times in the specific, controlled adrenaline way of trained soldiers who have learned to use fear as information rather than as an obstacle. But the thing she is actually afraid of, the underlying fear beneath the tactical fears, is not something she has found a way to address through preparation, and so she does not discuss it. The nearest she has come to articulating it, in one late-hour conversation with Celeste that neither of them has mentioned since, was to say that her particular nightmare is not dying in the field, but failing to pass on what she knows in time. The knowledge she has accumulated, the tactical knowledge, the arc behavioral analysis, the weapon profiling methodology, exists nowhere else. If she is gone before she has transferred enough of it to enough other people, some portion of what she knows goes with her, and the people who would have benefited from it don't benefit from it, and they don't come back. That is what she is afraid of, and so she continues. She maintains her weapon stock with the same methodical attention she gives to everything: regular inspection, condition assessment, maintenance when required, replacement when maintenance is no longer sufficient. Raiders occasionally ask why she maintains weapons at the level she does when the hub's conditions are far from the field, when the weapons sit in storage between transactions. She has a short answer for this, which is that the habit of maintenance is the difference between a functional weapon in the field and a non-functional one, and that the habit can only be maintained by maintaining it when it is not strictly necessary. She has a longer answer that she does not give, which is that she maintains her weapons the way she maintains everything, because the moment you stop maintaining something is the moment it starts failing. And the failure always comes at the moment you most need it not to. There is a specific moment in Shaunie's history at the hub that is often cited by those who witnessed it as the clearest single expression of who she is. A raiding group came back from the surface 2 members short, with the survivors in a state of shock that was partly tactical. They had encountered something new, a form of ARC behavior they had not seen before, and partly personal. The standard response in such situations would be to provide what support was needed, and then, in due course, to gather whatever operational intelligence could be extracted from the survivors for use in future missions. Shaunie did both of those things, in the opposite order. She debriefed them immediately, on the grounds that the tactical intelligence was time-sensitive, and that the 2 things were not in conflict. She could debrief them, and they could process what had happened simultaneously. And the debriefing would in some ways help them process it, because it gave the experience a structure. The survivors said afterward, when they were sufficiently recovered to reflect on it, that she was right about this, that having to organize what had happened in response to her questions helped them organize it for themselves, helped make it a thing that had occurred and could be understood rather than a thing that was still occurring. That is a sophisticated form of care, delivered in an unsentimental package. It is, in its way, characteristic of her. Her influence on the hub's culture, on what it means to be prepared, to be equipped, to be responsible about going topside, is deep and pervasive, and largely invisible because the culture has absorbed it to the point where it is no longer attributed to a source. The expectation that you brief before you go out, that you know your weapon, that you have a plan and a backup plan, that you assess the risk honestly rather than optimistically. These are now just how things are done at the hub. They were not always how things were done. They became how things are done because Shaunie was present and insistent and, above all, consistently right about the consequences of not doing them. The culture is her argument made fact. She ages with the economy of motion that long-trained physical people develop, efficiently, without waste, in a way that suggests that even the process of getting older is being managed with professional attention. Her face shows time. She has never had any interest in managing her appearance, which she considers a category of vanity that she does not have time for. But the eyes are the same eyes that read enemy patterns from a distance, that assess a raider's capability from the way they hold a weapon, that look at a zone map and identify vulnerabilities the way other people identify colors. The assessment continues. It will continue as long as she can hold the gaze. The hub is safer for it. Chapter 3. Tanwen, the engineer who made ammunition into alchemy. There is a distinction, not widely understood outside of certain technical communities, between the person who uses a weapon and the person who understands a weapon. Both are valuable. Only the second is indispensable in the way that transforms the word indispensable from a complement into a structural description. Tanwen is the second kind of person, applied with particular intensity to the domain of weapons and the ammunition that feeds them. And the indispensability he represents to the hub's raiding operations is the indispensability of deep technical knowledge in a world where deep technical knowledge has become, in the most literal sense, a survival factor. He does not fight. He barely goes to the surface. He does not need to. He is the reason the people who do go to the surface come back, or at least he is one of the central reasons. And his workbench is the place where the theoretical limits of what weapons can do are regularly, quietly, and without fanfare extended. He is the weapons and ammunition trader, but trader is almost a misleading designation, because what he actually does looks more like engineering than commerce, and the exchanges he makes are less about moving inventory than about transferring capability. Tanwen's background is in ballistics and propellant chemistry, a field that most people have never thought about and that turns out to be foundational for everything from civil engineering to pharmaceutical manufacturing, but which most people only encounter in its most obvious application, making things that can be launched accurately over distances. He studied in institutions that he has mentioned by name only rarely and always with an economy of description. He does not talk about his past with the narrative expansiveness of someone who finds their history interesting, but with the selective precision of someone who is determined exactly what is relevant to share and shares only that. What he has shared indicates a career that moved from academic research in propellant chemistry to applied work in munitions development, to something that he describes simply as consulting, which appears to have involved a number of clients in a number of regions with a number of different needs, and which suggests to anyone reading between the lines that his pre-ARC technical expertise was in significant demand in markets that are not always visible on official registries. He did not lose his knowledge when the ARC came, which is the first and most important fact about him in the context of the hub's survival. Many people lost everything: their tools, their materials, their context for application. Tanwen lost his tools and his materials and his institutional context, and he replaced all three within a period that people who know him find characteristically short and characteristically systematic. He built a workshop from salvage within the first weeks. Not a sophisticated workshop, but a functional one, with the specific items he needed to begin working in the specific order he needed to work through them. He sourced materials from the surface with the same single-minded focus that a craftsperson brings to finding the ingredients for a recipe they cannot proceed without. He adapted his knowledge to the available materials, which required genuine creativity. The propellant chemistries of pre-ARC manufacture were precisely calibrated to precise industrial inputs, and substitution required rethinking processes from first principles rather than simply replacing one chemical with another. He rethought them from first principles. He has very strong first principles. The ammunition he produces is not a reproduction of pre-ARC manufacture. It cannot be. The inputs are not the same. The equipment is not the same. The conditions are not the same. It is something different, which he finds more interesting than reproduction would be, because reproduction is a solved problem, and he prefers problems that have not been solved. The ballistic profiles of his custom loads are tuned to the specific conditions of the surface zones, the atmospheric particulate levels that affect projectile drag, the arc structural material properties that determine what penetration is necessary and what is excessive, the engagement distances that characterize the different zone types, and the precision tolerances they require. He produces loads for specific missions rather than general-purpose rounds where possible, because the gap between general-purpose and mission-specific in terms of practical performance is, depending on the scenario, the difference between adequate and decisive. Raiders who understand what he does come to him with specific zone assignments and specific threat profiles, and ask for loads matched to those parameters. He provides them. The conversation that precedes the provision is one of the most technically dense you can have at the hub, and also one of the most practical. His interest in ARC materials, the physical constituents of the machines themselves, is intense and ongoing, and has produced some of the more significant insights into ARC technology available anywhere in the underground. He is not a biologist or a physicist, but he is a chemist, and the material composition of ARC systems turns out to be a chemical question before it is anything else. He has been systematically analyzing ARC materials since the early period in collaboration with Celeste on the sourcing side and with Shaunie on the testing side, and the analysis has revealed several properties of ARC alloys and energy compounds that have no human manufacturing parallel and that suggest, to his trained interpretation, something significant about where the ARC came from and how they were made. He does not speculate about this publicly. He documents and analyzes, but the documentation, if you read it, has implications. The workbench where he does this work is simultaneously the most impressive and the most chaotic-looking space in the hub, which creates a specific type of cognitive dissonance for visitors who expect the domain of precision engineering to look more, well, precise. He knows where everything is. This is a critical fact. He knows where every item is on the bench, in the surrounding shelves, in the labeled and unlabeled containers along the walls. The apparent chaos is a product of working density, the workspace of someone who is always working, who picks up a tool and puts it down in a different place because the next tool is needed immediately, who labels things that need to stay labeled and does not label things that do not need labels because he will not forget what they are. He has, according to multiple witnesses, never failed to immediately locate an item he was looking for in that workspace, including items that had been there for years and that no one else could identify, let alone locate. The workspace is organized to his mind. His mind is very well organized. He is quiet. This is the quality most people mention first about him, and it is worth examining why. Because quiet covers a range of things. He is not quiet in the absent way of someone lost in distraction. He is quiet in the present way of someone who is paying attention to the world through a continuous internal analysis that does not require verbalization. He observes. He asks occasional questions that are precisely targeted to the specific information gap he is trying to close. And the precision of the questions is distinctive enough that experienced conversation partners quickly learn to answer carefully, because imprecise answers will be followed up with more questions until a precise answer is obtained. He is not impatient. He is thorough. The quiet is not emptiness, but density. The density of a mind that is continuously processing and that has learned to process more efficiently than it speaks. His trading practice is shaped by his deep knowledge of application. He will not sell ammunition that he has assessed as inappropriate for the buyer's use case, for the same fundamental reason that Shaunie will not sell the wrong weapon. The performance gap between appropriate and inappropriate is a safety variable, and safety variables are not negotiable. But he expresses this principle differently from Shaunie. Where Shaunie asks direct questions and delivers direct assessments, Tanwen tends to approach the same territory through technical description, explaining the ballistic characteristics of what he is selling, what they are optimized for, how they perform in conditions that differ from the optimum. The effect is the same. A raider who has been through his briefing understands what they have and what it will and will not do. But the method is more educational, more transferable, more likely to leave the raider with a framework they can apply to future decisions rather than just an answer to this specific question. He has made contributions to hub infrastructure that go beyond his official domain of weapons and ammunition. His knowledge of propellant chemistry overlaps with explosive engineering, energy storage, and several industrial processes that became relevant when the collective needed to fabricate, repair, or adapt systems with no supply chain to fall back on. He has provided technical input on fuel formulations when the hub's energy systems were under strain, on adhesives and sealants when structural repairs required chemistry that nobody else had, on the specific heat dynamics of confined space situations when that turned out to matter for a particular expansion of the underground complex. He does not advertise this breadth. He answers questions when they are asked of him, and when the questions fall within his knowledge, he answers them fully, and the breadth of his knowledge means they frequently do. His humor is dry to the point of near invisibility, a quality that he shares with Celeste, though the style is different. Celeste's humor is precise and occasionally cutting. Tanwen's is obscure, embedded in technical observations that are simultaneously accurate descriptions and commentary on the absurdity of a specific situation. Raiders who have been trading with him long enough have learned to listen for the shift in register that means he is being funny, because without that register shift it can be mistaken for a straightforwardly technical observation, which it also is. This double nature, the thing that is both exactly what it says and something more, is consistent with the way he operates generally. Nothing he says is just one thing. The arc as an engineering problem fascinates him in a way that he is careful not to let compromise his operational judgment, because fascination and operational reliability are not always compatible, and he knows it. He is aware that his interest in arc technology can create a pull toward understanding that edge case, exploring that anomalous material property, following that unexpected result down the chain of its implications, at the expense of the immediate practical work that the hub needs him to be doing. He manages this tension deliberately, allocating specific time to exploratory analysis and holding it separate from the production work that feeds raiders going topside. The boundary is maintained by discipline rather than disinterest. The interest is real. The discipline is also real. Both are characteristic of him. He and Shaunie have a relationship that is the closest thing to a genuine intellectual partnership that either of them has, which is somewhat ironic given that their personal styles are very different. Her directness and his quietness might seem incompatible in a social sense, but their shared interest in weapon system performance creates a technical common ground that transcends style. When they assess a new weapon or a new ammunition type together, the conversation has a quality that observers have described as almost musical. She identifies operational parameters, he identifies technical specifications, she proposes test conditions, He designs test protocols. She executes tests and delivers results. He analyzes results and extracts conclusions. The loop is efficient and self-correcting, and the products it generates are reliable in the way that good engineering is reliable. Raiders benefit from it without necessarily knowing where it comes from. There was a period, early in his time at the hub, when Tanwen's work was undervalued in the sense that its scope was not understood. People knew he made bullets. They did not fully understand that the bullets he made were not like the bullets they had found on the surface, that they performed differently, that the difference was significant, and that the significance was measurable and had been measured and could be explained. He gave, on one occasion, a demonstration that addressed this misunderstanding, not by argument, but by showing the relevant data from side-by-side tests of standard configuration ammunition versus his mission-optimized loads in realistic surface conditions. The data was presented on a series of hand-lettered charts he had produced himself, and the presentation was 20 minutes long and contained no rhetorical flourishes. At the end of it, the room was quiet in a way that is different from polite silence. It was the silence of people recalibrating their models. He is not needed to repeat the demonstration. His views on the Ark's origin are not something he discusses openly, but he is the person at the hub whose professional expertise gives him the best claim to an informed opinion on the material evidence. The alloys he has analyzed are not Earth-derived by any known geological or industrial process. The energy compounds are stable in ways that no human-designed chemistry has achieved for equivalent energy densities. The tolerances on Arc mechanical components, when he has been able to study them closely enough, exceed anything in the pre-Arc manufacturing record. These facts, taken together, point toward an engineering capability significantly beyond humanity's pre-Arc peak, and toward a manufacturing origin that is, by the material evidence alone, extraterrestrial. He documents this. He does not sensationalize it. It is what the evidence supports, and his job is to follow the evidence, not to manage the implications. He is meticulous about safety in his workspace in ways that go beyond the obvious cautions that anyone working with propellant chemistry must observe. He is meticulous about the safety of others in ways that go beyond his workspace. He has contributed to the hub's general safety protocols in several areas, particularly around the storage of reactive materials and the handling of arc energy components that have unstable properties under certain conditions. He identified a potentially catastrophic storage error in the hub's early configuration and addressed it without announcement, documenting the correction in his technical log in the same dry notation as everything else. The people responsible for the storage were informed after the fact. He did not make a scene of it. He fixed it and documented it, which is his approach to most problems. Identify, address, record. His appreciation for the surface zones is purely analytical. He has no romantic attachment to the above world, no nostalgic relationship with it as a former home. What he has is a continuous professional interest in the material profile of each zone, because the material profile determines what ammunition characteristics are most relevant to operations in that zone. And staying current on the material profile means staying current on the tactical technical calculus for raiders working there. He reads Celeste's zone assessments with more attention than almost anyone else, because his technical applications are most directly dependent on the material information they contain. He and Celeste have developed a shorthand in their exchange that is not exactly warmth, but is the closest technical thing to warmth that either of them practices. A level of brevity between them that implies deep mutual familiarity with each other's frameworks. The kind of shorthand that only exists between people who have been communicating long enough that the explicit statements have been replaced by implicit understandings. The ammunition he produces covers a spectrum from highly specialized mission loads to more general-purpose rounds that provide reliable performance across a range of conditions. And the choice of what to stock, at what quantities at any given time, is a continuous logistical optimization problem that he manages with the same obsessive precision he brings to the chemistry itself. He tracks usage patterns across raider groups, adjusts production priorities based on where raiding activity is concentrated, and what conditions those zones present, maintains buffer stocks of the most critical load types to ensure availability even when production is temporarily constrained by material shortages. This is not formally his logistical responsibility. Logistics at the hub is primarily Celeste's domain, But the technical specificity of ammunition production means that nobody else can manage the production side of the ammunition logistics, and so he manages it. And he manages it with the same rigor that characterizes everything he does. His understanding of failure modes is comprehensive and, in practical terms, more important than his understanding of optimal performance. Every weapon fails eventually. Every ammunition load has conditions under which it degrades or underperforms. The question of when and how things fail is the question that matters most in field operations, because a weapon that fails at the wrong moment in the wrong place is worse than no weapon at all, and a round that performs below specification in specific conditions can produce exactly that failure. He maps these failure modes with the same systematic thoroughness as his performance characterization, and he communicates them to raiders with the same honest completeness. The communication is, again, not just this particular load fails this way, but here is the physical reason why. Here is what the early indicators of that failure look like. Here is the decision point at which you should swap out or pull back. He gives people the reasoning, not just the rule, because people who understand the reasoning can apply it in conditions he has not anticipated. He has, over time, developed what he describes as a theory of arc materials' potential for human repurposing, an engineering framework for thinking about which properties of arc components can be leveraged by humans without the manufacturing capability to replicate them from scratch. The theory is technically dense and requires significant background to follow, but its practical implications are significant. Several of the weapons upgrades currently available at the hub derive directly from his analysis of arc components and his identification of human weapon-compatible interfaces for those components. These upgrades are not officially attributed to him, partly because he has never sought attribution, and partly because the development process was so incremental and so collaborative that clean attribution would be misleading. But the conceptual framework is his, and the people who know the history know it. He does not make promises he cannot keep. This sounds simple, and is actually rare. Specific claims about ammunition performance are verified claims derived from controlled tests and real-world field feedback, and the specifications he posts for his loads are the result of actual measurement rather than theoretical projection. When he does not know something, when a new material or a new arc configuration creates a performance question he has not yet resolved, he says so, and he says what he is doing to resolve it. And he provides an estimated timeline for resolution that is based on his actual work schedule, rather than on what the questioner wants to hear. In a trading environment where overstatement is the path of least resistance, his refusal to overstate is distinctive. It is also, ultimately, commercially effective in the best possible way. People trust his specifications absolutely, because they have never been wrong. And that absolute trust is worth more than any short-term advantage that embellishment might provide. He is one of the few people at the hub who consistently expresses something that might be called wonder, not in a showy way, not with exclamations or dramatic gestures, but in the specific quality of attention he brings to materials and mechanisms that he has not encountered before. There is a particular concentration in his engagement with a new material, a new arc component, a performance result that he did not predict, that is visible to people who know him and that functions as the most animated he gets. He becomes more still, which is how you know he is paying extreme attention, and then he starts asking questions. And the questions have the particular structure of someone whose existing model has been challenged and who is building a new one in real time. He finds genuine novelty genuinely interesting. In a world where novelty has generally taken the form of catastrophe, this is its own form of resilience. Chapter 4. Apollo, the inventor who turned chaos into craft. There is a type of mind that does not so much solve problems as reconfigure the space of problems, that looks at a fixed situation and identifies the dimension of it that everyone else has been treating as a constant, and that is, in fact, a variable. This type of mind is rare, and it is frequently difficult to be around because its tendency to see the hidden variable in things that everyone else has accepted as fixed makes it simultaneously more creative and more frustrating than minds that work within established parameters. It is, however, essential in a world where the established parameters no longer exist and where the only framework available is the one you build from what is in front of you. Apollo is that type of mind. He is the gadgets and grenades trader, the person who deals in the tools that are not quite weapons but are not quite anything else either. The deployable technologies, the electronic countermeasures, the explosive and non-explosive devices that extend a raider's tactical repertoire beyond what arms alone provide. But gadgets and grenades is a description of the inventory. The description of Apollo himself requires different language. He was, before the Ark came, what various official documents and professional listings called a designer, which is accurate in the way that calling the ocean water is accurate. Not wrong, but so incomplete as to be nearly misleading. He designed things, yes. He designed things that were, by the standards of his professional context, quite good, commercially successful, functionally innovative, frequently copied. He also designed things that were too strange to commercialize, too specific to be broadly applicable, too far ahead of the manufacturing curve to be producible at scale, and those things, the ones that never made it out of his notebook, or his workshop, or the small circle of people who were interested in ideas that had not been possible yet, were the ones he found interesting. The commercial work paid for the interesting work, and the interesting work was the reason he kept doing the commercial work. He was, in his pre-Ark life, in a state of productive tension between the marketable and the generative, and he had found a sustainable personal equilibrium in that tension that he was not unhappy with. The Ark collapse removed the commercial side of this equation completely and left only the generative side, which is perhaps the most unexpected form of liberation the post-Ark period produced in anyone at the hub. He had no market to design for anymore. He had no manufacturing constraints, because there was no manufacturing. He had no commercial considerations, because commerce had dissolved into survival. What he had was a world full of broken things, and a mind that had always been best at making new things from broken things. And the alignment between his capability and his environment was in the darkest possible context, nearly perfect. He was in the ruins with a designer's eye and a fabricator's hands, and more raw material than he had ever had access to. And the people around him needed what he could make from it, urgently and continuously, without the bureaucratic and commercial filters that had always stood between his ideas and their physical realization. His first gadgets were rough. Anyone who saw them and compares them to what he makes now will tell you that with the affection of people describing early work that reveals the seed of something much larger, but they were functional, which is more important than rough, and they were novel, which is what made them valuable. He made a sensor system from salvaged components that could detect arc approach signatures at a range that nobody else had achieved, using a combination of electromagnetic and acoustic analysis that he had worked out theoretically on paper before he had the components to test it. The sensor saved several lives before it was improved, and its improvement produced the second generation, and the second generation's improvement produced the third. And by the time he arrived at the hub, his sensor technology was several generations deep and had been adopted by most of the surviving groups in his region as standard equipment. He had not patented it. He had not protected it. He had explained how it worked to everyone who asked, which was his approach to everything he made. Make it, explain it, iterate. At the hub, he found a context that was, for the first time in his professional life, actually commensurate with what he was capable of. The resources were limited, always limited. The limitation was a constant, but the freedom was not. The problem space was defined by survival and by the specific parameters of arc-active surface environments, and within that problem space, he was not limited by market considerations or manufacturing constraints or design committee reviews. He was limited by physics and chemistry and the available materials, and those limits were productive in the way that real constraints are always more productive than arbitrary ones, because you know why they are there and you can work against them intelligently rather than around them bureaucratically. He began, from the day he arrived, to produce. His gadgets are distinguished by a characteristic that has no single name, but the designers sometimes describe as elegant inelegance. A quality of solutions that look improvised, but are actually precisely calculated, that use the minimum of material and complexity to achieve the maximum of function, that appear rough because rough is the honest expression of the available resources, but that perform with a precision that rough-appearing things are not supposed to have. He does not impose aesthetics on his work. He follows function, and the function, if followed honestly, produces its own aesthetic. the aesthetic of a thing that works as well as it can, given what it is made of. There is a beauty in that, he would argue if asked, and the arguing would be simultaneously earnest and self-aware, which is a quality he has in most of his conversations. The grenades, which are the explosive portion of his inventory, and which require a particular combination of chemical knowledge and mechanical precision that intersects with Tanwen's expertise in ways that have led to a productive collaboration, are similarly characterized by mission specificity rather than general-purpose design. He has concussive variants tuned to the resonance characteristics of different arc chassis types. He has thermal variants engineered for specific arc energy system disruption without the collateral damage of broader thermal weapons. He has a non-lethal disruption variant that has no parallel anywhere in the pre-arc military inventory, designed for situations where disabling without destroying is tactically preferable, which is a situation that occurs in arc encounters more often than most raiders initially expect. He made it because the situation kept coming up, and nothing existed to address it, and it needed to exist. His relationship with failure is perhaps the most philosophically developed of any of the traders, which is fitting for the person whose work involves the most frequent need to reckon with failure directly. He designs, he tests, he fails, he learns, he redesigns. This cycle is not a source of distress for him. It is the method. Failure is information, and information is the material he works with, as surely as wire and polymer and reactive compound. A device that fails in a specific way tells him something about the design that a device that succeeds does not, because success can be produced by multiple paths, and only failures show you which paths were wrong. He has a collection of failed devices that he keeps, not as trophies or as records of defeat, but as a reference library of negative results, things that don't work, preserved in their non-working state so that the lessons they contain are not lost when the iteration moves on. Apollo's personal energy is, by the standards of the hub, extremely high, not in the disruptive sense, but in the sense of a person for whom the normal human range of engagement is calibrated at a higher baseline than most people's. He is interested in things, in many things, in things that are not obviously relevant to his work, but that might become relevant, in things that are relevant to other people's work, and that he has questions about, in things that are just interesting without any particular utility attached. This curiosity is expansive and slightly anarchic, and it makes conversations with him unusual. They tend to start in one place and end somewhere quite different, following a logic that is entirely consistent internally, but that can be difficult to follow from outside his head. He has learned to annotate this, to flag the connection between one idea and the next before making it, so that people can follow along rather than simply observing the destination without the path. He is not always successful at this. He is improving. He admires all of the other traders, but his admiration takes different forms for each. For Celeste, it is the admiration of a systems thinker for someone who built a working system from almost nothing. He understands, more viscerally than most, how difficult that is and how many decisions could have gone wrong that she got right. For Shaunie, it is the admiration that creative people often have for highly disciplined people, a recognition that the kind of excellence she represents requires a form of dedication that is not the same as his, and that is, in some ways, more demanding because it involves less novelty and more repetition maintained at the same level of quality. For Tanwen, it is a peer admiration. They share a chemistry-adjacent knowledge base and a love of precision, and their collaboration is genuinely enjoyable for him in the way that working with someone technically excellent on a shared problem is enjoyable for anyone who loves both the work and the working. For Lance, it is an admiration with something adjacent to awe. He finds the commitment to repair, rather than to prevention or offense, to be the most quietly radical choice any of the traders has made. His gadget line expanded over time in ways that responded to actual raider needs rather than to any internal product roadmap. When raiders kept reporting a specific problem, a recurrent situation in a particular zone type, a failure mode in a standard tactical approach, Apollo typically had a gadget prototype in testing within a relatively short period that addressed the specific problem as his first priority. He did not try to generalize. He solved the specific problem, and then, if the solution turned out to have broader applicability, He generalized from the specific solution rather than from a prior generic framework. This bottom-up design philosophy produces solutions that are sometimes narrow in their formal definition, but immediately recognizable by the people with the specific problem as exactly what they needed. And the speed with which those recognitions occur is its own kind of confirmation that the approach is right. The electronic countermeasures he developed, devices designed to disrupt, confuse, or redirect arc sensor and communication systems, represent perhaps his most technically significant work. They are based on a deep analysis of arc communication protocols that he conducted in collaboration with Tanwen, using material analysis and captured arc component behavior to reverse engineer aspects of how the machines coordinate. The countermeasures that emerged from this analysis do not always work consistently. Arc systems appear to adapt to countermeasures over time in ways that suggest either learning or centralized countermeasure development. But they work often enough, and unpredictably enough from the arc's apparent perspective, to provide meaningful tactical advantages in specific situations. He tracks their effectiveness and updates them on a continuous basis, treating the countermeasure development as an ongoing arms race rather than a solved problem. His workshop is the opposite of Tanwen's, in visual character, but similar in organizational logic. Where Tanwen's is dense and appears chaotic, Apollo's is spread out and appears deliberate, with work in visible stages of development occupying different areas of the space. You can walk through his workshop and see the entire current design process laid out spatially. Early concepts and rough prototypes here, mid-stage development and testing iterations there, near-complete devices over there, finished items waiting for the trading inventory along the far wall. It is the physical organization of a design process rather than a storage organization, and it means the workshop tells you at any given moment what he is working on and roughly where in the development cycle each thing is. He intends this. He wants people to be able to see the work, not because he needs the audience, but because he believes the work being visible creates accountability. To himself primarily, accountability to finish things rather than indefinitely iterate. He is the trader most likely to be found somewhere other than his trading post during active hub hours, which occasionally creates locating problems for raiders who want to trade. He will be in someone else's workshop discussing a technical problem that interested him. He will be in the hub's engineering space adapting something. He will be in a corner with a notebook, working through a design problem that he woke up thinking about. He returns quickly when sought and fulfills transactions promptly. He does not neglect his trading role, but he is not a person who stays in one place when the world is full of other places that might contain interesting problems. And the hub accommodates this because the alternative, a more confined Apollo, would also be a less productive Apollo, and the production is worth the occasional search. The specific quality that distinguishes his gadgets in field use, the quality that veterans specifically request and newer raiders quickly come to appreciate, is what they call reliability of surprise. His devices do not always perform in the way that their technical specifications formally describe, and this is not a flaw. The specifications describe the design function. The reliability of surprise refers to the secondary effects, the ways his devices interact with specific arc systems in ways he predicted but did not advertise, the performance characteristics that emerge from the quality of construction rather than from explicit design, the durability under conditions of misuse or improvised application that the devices were not designed for, but that they handle anyway because he overbuilds for longevity, without ever explicitly calling this a feature. Raiders learn to trust his equipment in the particular way you trust equipment that has surprised you pleasantly multiple times, with a certain expansive confidence that it will probably do something useful, even in the scenario you did not plan for. He talks to himself in the workshop. This is widely known. He does not seem embarrassed by it when people observe it, and the people who observe it quickly notice that the monologue is not random, but is the verbalized version of his design process. He is narrating his own thinking, talking through the logic of a design decision, arguing with his earlier assumptions, asking himself questions, and then answering them. Some people find it unusual, others find it clarifying because it offers a window into a mind that does not otherwise make its process visible. The verbalization is, he would tell you if you asked, a tool. He thinks more clearly when the thinking is externalized, when the ideas are outside his head and can be seen and evaluated rather than just felt. He has always worked this way. The hub has simply provided the most sustained audience this habit has ever had. The grenades, in particular, represent a domain where his work has evolved the furthest from its starting point. His earliest explosive devices were functional, but broadly destructive. The kind of thing you make when your primary concern is that it work rather than that it work precisely. As his understanding of arc structural engineering deepened, his explosive designs became more targeted, more specific in their interaction with arc systems, more differentiated by the type of arc target they were intended for. He distinguishes between arc types, scout units, heavy units, coordination units, stationary emplacements, with a granularity that most raiders do not initially have, and that he communicates through the design of the devices themselves, because a device engineered for a specific target type communicates, through its engineering, what it knows about that target. Using his devices is also, in a quiet way, an education in arc anatomy. He has opinions about the arc that are distinct from the other traders, not about their tactical characteristics, which he leaves to Shaunie, or their material properties which he shares with Tanwen, but about what they imply about the nature of intelligence and design. The arc are engineered things, and he spends more time than most thinking about who engineered them and what the engineering choices reveal about that engineer. He does not find the arc hostile in the way that people find an enemy hostile. He finds them hostile in the way that he finds a device that is doing what it was designed to do, hostile when what it was designed to do is harmful. The appropriate response to a badly designed thing, from his perspective, is to understand the design and then to design something better. He is working on this. The hub considers Apollo one of its more unpredictable assets, which is meant affectionately, but is also accurate. His contributions appear in the logistical record in non-linear fashion, a major advance followed by a period of apparent quiet that is actually a period of deep development work, followed by several breakthroughs in rapid succession. His productivity does not have the steady, continuous character of Celeste's or the precise rhythm of Tanwen's. It has the character of creative production, intensive, variable, higher variance in quality, but with the highest ceiling of any of the trader's outputs on the occasions when the work is fully developed. Managing expectations around this, both his own and others, is something he has worked on throughout his time at the hub, with mixed results. He is better at it than he used to be. He is not very good at it. He is honest about both of these things. He is, in the end, irreplaceable in the specific way that creative people who are very good at what they do are irreplaceable. Not because no one else could do a version of his work, but because the specific configuration of knowledge, intuition, curiosity, and technical skill that produces his particular version of his work is not replicable. You could fill his role with someone competent. You could not fill it with someone who does exactly what he does, because exactly what he does is the product of exactly who he is. And that is not a reproducible specification. The hub knows this. He probably knows it too, though he would not say so because saying so sounds like pride, and he finds pride unproductive. Pride is a feeling about your work rather than engagement with your work, and engagement is what makes the work. Chapter 5. Lance, the medic who refused to define the limits of possible. Every system of survival makes choices about what is worth preserving, and the choices a system makes about what is worth preserving tell you more about the character of that system than any other feature you might examine. The choice Celeste made was, the material resources of the world are worth preserving. The choice Shaunie made was, the capacity for organized defense is worth preserving. The choice Tanwen made was, the technical knowledge required for precision is worth preserving. The choice Apollo made was, the creative intelligence required for adaptation is worth preserving. The choice Lance made is different from all of them, and in a certain sense, underlies all of them. The people themselves are worth preserving, at whatever cost, through whatever means, past whatever point a rational assessment of resources and probability might say is no longer justified. Lance is the medical and supplies trader. He is also the person who decided, at some point in the early chaos, that the category not worth saving was a category he was not going to use, and that this decision, made in a particular moment under particular pressure, in circumstances that he has never fully described to anyone, was going to define the rest of his professional life. Lance's pre-arc background is in emergency medicine, in the specific brutal subspecialty of trauma surgery and emergency intervention that operates at the threshold of survivability. The zone where the question is not how to treat something, but whether the treatment is worth attempting given the severity of the condition and the available resources. This is a discipline that develops in its practitioners a very particular relationship with both life and death, which is not the romantic relationship depicted in stories, but is more complicated, more weary, more practical, and ultimately, more durable. He had worked in emergency departments, in conflict-zone field medicine, in disaster response teams. He had seen what human bodies could survive when someone refused to give up on them, and he had also seen what they could not survive even when someone refused to give up. He had the statistics on survivability margins, the physiological parameters, the evidence-based decision frameworks for resource allocation in mass casualty events. He had all of this, and he had the operational experience of applying it under conditions that made the frameworks difficult to maintain and the statistics feel false. He came to the hub carrying two things that are not usually found together in the same person: a complete clinical picture of what trauma does to the human body and what can be done about it, and a fundamental refusal to let the clinical picture determine the decision. The clinical picture said, with these resources, given these injuries, the probability of survival is X. Lance said, the probability is X, and we are attempting this anyway, and we will see whether X was right. This is not anti-scientific. It is, in fact, the correct relationship with statistics. The statistic describes the average of a distribution, not the outcome of an individual case. And the individual case always has the possibility of being in the tail of the distribution. He stays for the tail. His trading post is the most intimately organized of the five, which is to say, it is organized around human dimensions and human needs in ways that the others are not. Celeste's space is organized around materials and their properties. Shaunie's is organized around function and threat type. Tanwen's is organized around his own working process. Apollo's is organized around design process. Lance's is organized around the person on the table, around what someone who just came back from the surface needs, what they need it in what order, what supplies follow from what injuries in what sequence. He has thought very carefully about the workflow of emergency treatment in a resource-constrained environment, and the organization of his space reflects that thinking. The most commonly needed supplies are the most accessible. The more specialized items are behind them, reachable without turning around, because turning around in a treatment situation costs time. He has measured the costs and organized accordingly. He was not the only medic at the hub before, and he is not the only medic at the hub now. But he is the one with the trading role, which means he is the one who has thought most systematically about the supply chain for medical resources, where they come from, how they are processed and standardized for hub use, how they should be priced relative to what people can pay, and how the inevitable tension between necessary resource conservation and the imperative to treat everyone who needs treatment is managed. This last question is the one that keeps him up at night, figuratively and occasionally literally, because there is no resolution to it. Resources are finite, need is not. Every triage decision, every choice about which supply goes to which raider at which time, involves a preference that disadvantages someone. He makes these decisions with the same professionalism and transparency that characterize all of his work, and he hates making them, and he keeps making them. The supplies he stocks go beyond the strictly medical. He deals in the broad category of operational survival support, food concentrates and water purification, environmental protection gear for zone-specific hazard types, the pharmaceutical supplies that keep people functional in prolonged surface operations, the psychological support tools. And there are such things, specific materials and provisions and protocols that address the non-physical aspects of raiding. He was the first person at the hub to formally advocate for the inclusion of psychological support in the operational supply chain, which was controversial when he proposed it, and which is now standard practice, which trajectory is characteristic of his more forward-looking positions generally. His understanding of arc-inflicted trauma is more detailed than anyone else's, because he has treated more of it than anyone else, and because he approaches the treatment of arc-inflicted injuries with the same systematic analytical rigor as everything else. He documents every case, anonymized, with patient consent, following the same ethical protocols he would have followed in a pre-ARC institutional setting, even though there is no institutional oversight to enforce those protocols, because the protocols are not about external enforcement, they are about what is right. His documentation of ARC injury patterns has produced a body of clinical knowledge that has no parallel anywhere. Because there was no parallel, ARC encounters and their medical consequences were not a known category before the ARC came, and the knowledge has to be built from the cases as they occur. His case database is the closest thing the post-ARC world has to a clinical literature on the subject, and it is entirely the product of his refusal to let any encounter go undocumented. He has opinions about raider risk tolerance that he expresses in the particular way of someone who sees the consequences of those tolerances professionally and constantly. He does not moralize. He does not shame. He does not tell people they should not take risks. He provides information. Here is what the injury distribution looks like in Zone X at current ARC activity levels. Here is what the treatment capacity for those injuries currently is. Here is the estimated recovery timeline for the most common injuries. Here is what that recovery timeline means for your operational continuity. He presents the information and lets people decide with it, which is, he believes, both the ethical approach and the practical one. People who are given information make better decisions than people who are told what to do, and better decisions mean fewer consequences for him to manage. His relationship with death is the most developed of any of the traders, which is not a competition, but an observation about the territory his work occupies. He has watched people die who should not have died, due to resource constraints, due to timing, due to the specific physics of the injuries they sustained. He has also watched people live who should not have lived, which is equally important to his worldview and perhaps more important to his practice, because those cases are the argument against accepting the statistical prediction as the final word. He carries both sets of cases with him, the losses and the survivals, not as emotional burden in the paralyzing sense, but as evidence, as the empirical data that informs his understanding of the territory and of how to operate within it. He came to know the other traders over time, in the way that people come to know each other when they share not just a space, but a commitment, a shared investment in the survival of the same people, approached from different angles, but converging on the same goal. With Celeste, the connection is about systems. He respects her systems building, in part because he has built his own, and the overlap in their approaches produces a mutual recognition that is the closest he gets to intellectual kinship. With Shaunie, the connection is about the before. Both of them had seen organized violence before the ARC. Both of them had developed professional frameworks for managing its consequences. And there is a fluency between them around certain subjects that does not require explanation because both of them already know. With Tanwen, the connection is about precision. They share an appreciation for the importance of exact knowledge over approximate knowledge, and their occasional technical exchanges, particularly around the physiological effects of specific ARC weapons on human tissue, have produced insights that neither of them could have reached alone. With Apollo, the connection is something he would describe as hope, not the naive form of hope, but the operational form. The form that says the existing parameters are not the fixed parameters, and that design and invention can move the boundary. The supplies line he maintains has expanded continuously as the needs of raiding operations have evolved and as his own knowledge of those needs has deepened. He added environmental medicine components when raiding expanded into zones with specific atmospheric hazard profiles. He added long-duration operational nutrition when raiders began taking on missions that extended beyond the original operational tempo. He added advanced wound management specifically for arc energy weapon injuries when his case data identified that this was the most common gap in standard treatment capability. Each expansion was documented, rationalized, and implemented with the same methodical care as the medical decisions he makes, with evidence, with explicit reasoning, with a record that someone could review and learn from. He does not guess. He responds to what the evidence shows. He has trained other medics, not as a formal training program. The hub does not yet have a formal medical training infrastructure, which is something he advocates for constantly and has not yet fully achieved. But through one-on-one teaching, through case review with interested parties, through the documentation he makes available to anyone who wants to read it, He is generous with his knowledge in the specific way of teachers who understand that the value of knowledge is multiplied by its distribution. Every person at the hub who can perform a competent emergency intervention is a life that would not otherwise be saved. And there is no version of Lance's commitment to preserving people that does not include preserving the capacity to preserve people, which requires transmission. There is an aspect of his character that is not visible in the professional description, but that is present in the observations of everyone who has worked with him closely. He is, in some profound and settled way, at peace with doing what he does. Not happy in the simple sense. His work is not work that produces simple happiness, but at peace with the terms of it, with the wins and the losses, with the limitations and the possibilities, with the fact that he is in exactly the position he should be in, doing exactly what he should be doing, and that this position has costs that he has accepted, and that the acceptance is not resignation, but commitment. This quality, the settled, non-theatrical quality of someone who has found the right place for their particular form of devotion, is part of why people trust him, perhaps even more fundamentally than the clinical competence. People can sense when someone is where they are supposed to be. They find it reassuring. Lance, in the middle of everything that is not reassuring about the post-Ark world, is reassuring. He does not take unnecessary risks himself. This might seem obvious. A medic who gets injured cannot treat injuries. But it is worth noting because it requires a specific form of self-regulation that is not universal among people who work in high-stakes environments. The instinct to intervene, to be where the action is, to treat in the field rather than at the post, is a real instinct in emergency medicine practitioners, and it is not always wrong. Lance has a calibrated version of it. He knows when field treatment is better than base treatment for specific injury types and conditions, and he goes to the field in those cases, and he is careful when he does. He does not go to the field because it is exciting or because he feels guilty being safe when others are not. He goes when going is medically justified, and stays when staying is medically justified, and the justification is the only criterion. His supply chain for medical resources is, from a logistical perspective, the most challenging of all the traders, because medical supplies have a shelf life, a storage requirement, and a specificity of application that raw materials and weapons do not. A medical supply that is not stored correctly may be unusable when needed. A supply that is nearly right is not good enough for most clinical applications. A supply that has exceeded its stability window has to be discarded regardless of the shortage it creates. Managing this, ensuring that the supply chain is not just full but functional, not just present but current, not just available but appropriate, is a continuous operational challenge that he addresses with the same systematic intelligence that he brings to everything. He has developed storage protocols, rotation schedules, acquisition priority lists, and substitute material assessments, all of them documented and reviewed regularly, that maintain the clinical viability of the supply chain under conditions that are not designed for clinical viability. The raiders who come to him most frequently, the ones with the most wear on their bodies, the ones who have been going topside the longest and the most often, are also the ones who tend to talk to him most, which is probably not a coincidence. He is the person at the hub whose professional role most explicitly involves caring about the individual, and the raiders who have been at this long enough to feel the cumulative weight of it find in him a form of honest attention that does not require them to perform wellness. He does not expect them to be fine. He expects them to be whatever they are, and he works with that. This is, in the post-Ark world, rarer than it should be and more valuable than it seems. He has a particular concern about the long-term medical implications of extended Ark exposure, the effects of repeated proximity to Ark energy fields and materials on human physiology over time. This is an area where his case database is still building, where the longitudinal data needed for firm conclusions does not yet exist, and where the preliminary observations are concerning enough to require serious attention, but uncertain enough to require extreme caution in interpretation. He has begun publishing interim analyses to the hub's internal documentation system, framed carefully as preliminary findings, requiring further observation, and he has initiated a voluntary longitudinal monitoring program for long-term raiders with the explicit goal of building the dataset that will eventually allow definitive conclusions. He does not know what those conclusions will be. He is building the apparatus to find them. His optimism, and he does have it, underneath the clinical precision and the realistic assessment of difficulties, is not the optimism of someone who does not know what can go wrong. It is the optimism of someone who has been in the worst of it and has continued to believe that the outcome is not yet determined, that there is still, in the space between the injury and the death, the treatment, that there is still, in the space between the problem and the catastrophe, the solution, that the final word has not been spoken yet, and that the appropriate response to this is not confidence but action, continuous, precise, evidence-based action that moves the probability in the right direction, one case at a time. This is Lance's theology, if he can be said to have one, and it is expressed not in words, but in the sustained quality of the work, day after day. In a world where day after day is not guaranteed, and where doing the work anyway is the whole argument, he keeps a record of every raider he has treated who has survived an injury that the probability distributions said they would not. The record is not large. Survivals against the odds are still survivals against the odds, which means they are rare by definition, but it is not empty. He adds to it when he can. He reads it occasionally, not for comfort exactly, but for information. This case, these conditions, this intervention, this outcome, the tale of the distribution, the evidence that the expected value is not the only value, that the person in front of you is a case with a number on it, and also a case that might be the exception. He stays for the exception. He keeps staying. The 5 traders, Celeste, Shaunie, Tanwen, Apollo, Lance, are not a team in any formal sense, and are not friends in any easy sense. They are 5 people in the same place with different knowledge and different histories and a shared commitment to the survival of the people they serve. And that commitment, held differently and expressed differently by each of them, produces something that is more than the sum of its parts. The hub works because the knowledge they each hold fits together. The materials and the weapons and the ammunition and the gadgets and the medicine are the complete kit, the full expression of what it takes to go topside and come back, and the people behind those things are the reason the kit is what it is, and not something lesser. The Ark came down from the sky and took almost everything. These 5 people decided that almost everything was not everything, and that what was left was worth building from. They are still building. They have not stopped. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end, you are exactly the kind of person this video was made for. Someone who wants to feel this world, not just survive it. Please leave a like if you found the lore compelling. Share this with anyone who plays Ark Raiders or loves deep dive lore content. And remember, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. These stories take enormous effort to research and assemble, and every subscriber makes it possible to keep going. Until next time. Chapter 6. The Hub. How 5 strangers built something that should not exist. The hub was not designed. This is the first and most important thing to understand about it, because designed things have architects, and architects have intentions, and intentions produce structures that reflect those intentions, orderly and deliberate, and shaped by whatever vision preceded the construction. The hub was not shaped by a vision. It was shaped by necessity, by the accumulation of decisions made under pressure by people who needed something to exist before they could articulate what exactly that something was. It grew the way organisms grow, from the inside out, adding what was needed when it was needed, in the direction that survival required, without a blueprint and without a plan, and with a pragmatic disregard for elegance that produced, paradoxically, a kind of structural honesty that purely designed spaces rarely achieve. The hub is exactly what it is. It is not trying to be anything else. And within the framework of a world that lost most of what it was trying to be, exactly what it is turns out to be remarkable. The physical space that became the hub was not chosen for its aesthetic qualities. It was chosen for the specific combination of structural integrity, underground access depth, available volume, and proximity to surface extraction zones that made it useful rather than merely habitable. Celeste made this assessment before anyone else arrived, during one of her early circle walks, and her notation from that period describes it in the characteristically dry language of her field assessments. Viable primary node. Class 2 structural integrity. Access via 3 independent routes. surface proximity within operational parameters for current extraction zones, material inventory adjacent approximate 40% above baseline for equivalent volume. What this notation does not capture, and what no notation could capture, is the quality of the space itself, the particular texture of its darkness, the specific sound of its silence, the way it felt when you first arrived in it and sat down and understood that the structure above you was not going to fall, like the first thing in a long time that was not trying to hurt you. The first occupants arrived sporadically, guided by the same network of whispers and practical recommendations that had been routing people towards Celeste's assessments for months. They came with what they had, which was varying in quantity and quality, but universally precious to them, and they found a space that had already been assessed, and in Celeste's minimal but precise way, organized, the structural weak points noted and avoided, the best access routes marked, the first inventory begun. They were not greeted warmly because Celeste did not do warm greetings. They were informed, efficiently and completely, of what the space was, what it could provide, what was expected of anyone who used it, and what was available in exchange for specific forms of contribution. This was not hostility. It was the language of survival being spoken fluently by someone who had been speaking it longer than most of them had, and the people who heard it recognized it for what it was, because they were learning to speak it themselves. Shaunie arrived at the hub during what the surviving logs describe as the third month of its organized operation, which by that time meant a collective of approximately 40 people in various stages of establishment. She did not arrive humbly. She arrived with a security assessment of the hub's current vulnerabilities that she had conducted from outside before entering, which is exactly as characteristic of her as it sounds. She had spent 3 days observing the hub's traffic patterns and ingress/egress behavior before making contact, mapping its operational security picture with the thoroughness of a professional who cannot turn off the professional. When she shared this assessment, unprompted in the first meeting she attended, the room's reaction was the same recalibrating silence that greeted most of her significant contributions, the silence of people whose model of a situation has been suddenly and substantially upgraded. She was offered a role that same day. The role was not yet the weapons trading post. It was security coordination, which evolved into the trading post over the subsequent weeks as the need for a formal weapons exchange became apparent and as Shaunie was the obvious person to manage it. Tanwen came later, brought by a chain of referrals so long that neither he nor anyone else can now reconstruct it fully. Someone knew someone who had heard about someone who made ammunition that was different from anything else available, not just functional, but precisely functional, tuned in ways that suggested a depth of technical knowledge that was unusual anywhere in the current landscape. The referral chain eventually reached someone who was actively looking for the hub's missing technical capability and who made the connection. Tanwen arrived with his tools, his materials, and his notebooks, and his assessment of the hub was purely technical. He evaluated the space for workshop viability before he evaluated it for any other purpose. He found it acceptable. He stayed. Apollo arrived in the way that Apollo arrives everywhere, somewhat suddenly, with an armful of prototypes, talking very quickly about something that required significant context to follow. He had been working independently in a zone that was, by most assessments, too exposed for a solo operator. Sustained by the combination of his sensor technology and his ability to improvise solutions to problems on a timeline that compressed what should have taken days into hours. Someone from the hub had encountered one of his sensor installations in the field, one of the ones he had left for others to find in his pre-hub practice, and had tracked the installation to its source. Apollo had been, by that point, looking for the hub without knowing quite where it was, which was not surprising given that the hub was specifically designed not to be easy to find. When he arrived, the hub found in him something it had not known it was missing. The person who would turn its material resources into things that did not yet exist, but needed to. Lance was the last of the 5 to arrive, and his arrival was, by multiple accounts, the most dramatic in the least dramatic way. Which is to say that nothing visible was dramatic about it, but that the shift in the hub's capacity was so immediate and so significant that the people who were present for his first week still described that period as a before and after line in the hub's history. He came with medical supplies that he had accumulated and transported at significant personal risk. with case notes from treatments he had conducted in 3 different survivor communities on his way to the hub. And with the particular quality of someone who has been managing too much alone for too long, and who recognizes on arrival at a place that could share the load, something very close to relief. He set up his station with a methodical speed that impressed even Celeste. By the end of his first day, 3 raiders who had been managing injuries from their last surface run had been properly treated for the first time. The before and after was that immediate. The 5 traders did not immediately form anything that could be called a working relationship. They were 5 people in a shared space with different domains and different styles and different histories, and the initial dynamic was less collaborative than parallel. Each of them doing their work in their lane, interacting at the boundaries when the boundaries overlapped, not yet knowing each other well enough to know where the real overlaps were. The overlaps revealed themselves over time, through situations that required more than one domain to address, through problems that crossed the lines between material and security and technical and medical and inventive. The situations were frequent. The problems were the nature of the post-arc world, and the people who had to address them together, doing it well and doing it badly and doing it again better, were finding out through that process who the others were. The first real test of the hub as a collective, not just as a gathering place, but as an entity that could act together under pressure, came when the Ark shifted its activity pattern in a way that simultaneously threatened 2 of the hub's primary surface zones and created a new threat corridor that passed uncomfortably close to the hub itself. The response required all 5 traders, in a way that the ordinary operation of the hub did not. Celeste, to rapidly assess alternative material sources and the logistics of transitioning to them. Shaunie, to redraw the security perimeter and the threat assessment protocols for the changed environment. Tanwen, to develop specific ammunition loads for the new threat type the corridor shift introduced. Apollo, to deploy countermeasure devices along the new threat corridor at a speed and scale he had not previously attempted. And Lance, to restructure his treatment capacity for the elevated casualty probability the threat shift implied. They did all of this simultaneously, over approximately 72 hours, in a state of high pressure and incomplete information, and the hub survived the shift without catastrophic loss. It was not a clean operation. It was, in several specific respects, improvised in ways that a fully rehearsed response would not have required. But it worked. And the working of it together, the 5 of them, in those 72 hours, producing something that none of them could have produced alone, changed the dynamic in ways that no number of normal operating days would have changed. After that event, the traders began to talk differently, not more personally. That came later, in some cases much later, and in some cases perhaps not yet, but more directly, more with the assumption of shared context that comes from having been through something together. Shaunie began consulting Celeste on threat assessments in surface zones before Celeste's material surveys were complete, and Celeste began flagging zone changes to Shaunie before they were reflected in the public assessments. Tanwen began sharing material analysis results with Apollo as a matter of course, rather than waiting for Apollo to ask. Lance began coordinating with Celeste on supply chain priorities in ways that took Celeste's material tracking into account for medical sourcing, and Celeste began factoring medical supply demand into her overall resource priority assessments. Apollo began designing gadgets in response to technical problems that Shaunie identified without waiting for a formal request. The integration was not announced. It just happened, because it was the natural result of 5 people who respected each other's competence, beginning to act on that respect in practical terms. The hub's physical evolution over the years mirrors the traders' growing understanding of what was needed. The initial space was functional but minimal, the kind of place you set up when you are not sure you will be there long, and you are conserving the resources required for permanence. As the collective grew, and the traders became more established, and the hub's role in the surrounding raider network became clearer, the physical space expanded in response. New sections were opened and assessed and incorporated. Existing sections were improved as improved materials became available through Celeste's sourcing work. The lighting was upgraded when Tanwen identified a more efficient power application for the hub's generator network. The medical wing, Lance's persistent advocacy made this a formal designation eventually, was expanded twice. Apollo's workshop has expanded 3 times from its original footprint and now occupies a section that would have seemed impossibly large in the hub's early days. Shaunie's trading post has remained roughly the same size because she determined early the minimum space required and built to that specification and has not found reason to revise it. The people who live and work in the hub have a relationship with the traders that is not quite like any pre-arc social relationship and not quite like the purely transactional relationships that pure commerce produces. It is closer to something that pre-arc social science might have called institutional trust. Trust not in a person, but in a role, in a system, in the consistent performance of a function that people depend on. You trust the traders not because you know them intimately, though some people know some of them fairly well by now, but because the traders have consistently done what they are there to do, and the doing of it, maintained over time, produces a confidence that the function will continue to be performed. This is different from personal loyalty. It is more durable in some ways and more conditional in others. It is the trust that keeps the system running. The economic system of the hub, the rates and exchanges and valuations that govern the flow of resources, is the traders' collective creation, assembled not through formal agreement, but through the accumulation of individual decisions that were independently principled and therefore compatible. Celeste set the fairness standard for material exchange. Shaunie set the transparency standard for weapons capability. Tanwen set the accuracy standard for technical specifications. Apollo set the honesty standard for gadget performance limitations. Lance set the ethical standard for medical supply prioritization. Each of these standards, applied consistently in one domain, implicitly constrained the standards in adjacent domains. You could not maintain gross unfairness in weapons exchange when the adjacent material exchange was visibly fair, because the comparison was too immediate. The standards reinforced each other. The system that resulted is not perfect. No economic system is perfect, but it is more functional than any of the alternatives that have been tried in the post-arc landscape, and its functionality is directly traceable to the traders' individual commitments to their individual standards. The hub has attracted attention from outside, not just from raiders and survivor groups seeking resources and information, but from larger organizational structures attempting to consolidate underground networks into more centralized governance systems. The traders have navigated these approaches with a consistent position that none of them formally agreed on, but that all of them independently arrived at. The hub's organizational autonomy is not for sale, not negotiable, and not something that can be offered as a trade for protection or resources, because the hub's value to everyone who depends on it derives directly from its independence. A hub that is controlled by a larger structure is a hub whose decisions reflect that structure's interests rather than the interests of the raiders it serves. And that shift in interest alignment would corrode the trust the system depends on. They have all turned down significant offers. None of them regrets it. Newcomers to the hub learn the traders in a specific order that is determined not by any protocol, but by the sequence of needs that new arrival generates. You come to Celeste first because you need to know what you have and what it is worth. You come to Lance quickly after because the surface takes things from you that need addressing. You come to Shaunie before you go back out because you need what will keep you alive up there. You come to Tanwen because Shaunie told you that what you are carrying needs better rounds for the zone you are heading to. You come to Apollo when you have been out enough times to know that the standard kit is not sufficient for what you keep encountering. The sequence is not a curriculum. It is the shape of the learning that survival requires. The traders, whether they see it this way or not, are the faculty of that curriculum, teaching through the quality of what they provide rather than through formal instruction. The hub has a mythology that has developed organically from the stories that raiders tell each other, the accounts of trades that changed a mission outcome, of information that saved a life, of something Apollo made that did something nobody expected, of Lance treating someone who should not have survived, and they survived. These stories are not all accurate in their details, which is the nature of mythology. It does not preserve detail, it preserves meaning. The meaning of the hub stories is consistent. There are people here who know things and who care whether you come back, and the caring is expressed through the knowing, through the things they make and the information they share and the treatments they provide. That is the mythology. It is also, in its essentials, the truth. The traders themselves are not universally comfortable with their mythologized status. Celeste finds it irrelevant and does not think about it much. Shaunie finds it professionally useful and monitors it with the attention of someone who understands that reputation is a tactical asset. Tanwen seems to be genuinely unaware of it most of the time, which is characteristic of someone whose attention is too fully occupied by the work to have much left over for his place in the narrative of the work. Apollo finds it genuinely amusing and has, on at least 2 known occasions, told a raider a story about himself that was so elaborated from its factual basis as to constitute a separate story, which he found funnier than the raider did. Lance is the one most clearly affected by it, not in a way that changes what he does, but in the occasional moments when a raider references a specific treatment or a specific survival, and the reference is to something he remembers, and the weight of the remembering is visible, briefly, before the clinical professionalism closes over it. The hub's internal culture has certain values that are not written down and are not enforced by any formal mechanism, but that are maintained by social pressure and by the consistent example of the people at the center of the community. Honesty about capability, your own and that of the equipment you carry, is one of them. Preparation before action is another. Sharing useful information rather than hoarding it for advantage. Respecting the resource constraints that affect everyone, while also not using those constraints as an excuse for inadequate care or inferior work. These values are Celeste's and Shaunie's and Tanwen's and Apollo's and Lance's, embedded in the culture by their daily enactment rather than by declaration. The hub is, in a profound sense, an expression of the 5 people at its center, not their personalities, which are different enough that a culture reflecting all of them equally should be incoherent, but their principles, which are different in their specific domains and compatible in their fundamental structure. The arguments the traders have, and they do argue, though not often and not in front of people, are not about values, but about judgment, about which zone assessment takes priority when material needs and security considerations conflict, about whether a specific technical upgrade to a weapon system is worth the material cost at the current material supply level, about how to allocate medical supplies in a period of simultaneous scarcity and elevated need, about whether a specific gadget line should be deprioritized in favor of a more immediately necessary line given workshop capacity constraints. These are real arguments about real trade-offs with real consequences, and they are resolved through the process of people who respect each other's reasoning, engaging with it honestly, and reaching a conclusion that each of them can accept, even when it is not their first preference. The process is not always clean. The outcomes are generally good. One of the more illuminating aspects of the hub's development is the way its external reputation has evolved relative to the traders' own understanding of what they are doing. From outside, from the perspective of other survivor groups, of raider networks that intersect with the hub, of the broader underground community that knows of it primarily through the accounts of people who have been there, the hub has become, over time, something close to a legend. The place where the traders are, the place where you can get what you actually need, honestly assessed, fairly exchanged, with information attached that improves your survival probability. The legend is not wrong. It is, if anything, an understatement, because the legend can only describe what is visible from outside, and the full picture of what the traders do, and why, and how, is not visible from outside. From inside, it is more complex and more human and more difficult, and in the ways that matter, more impressive than the legend. The physical hub, the actual structure, the rooms and corridors and the systems Tanwen has optimized, and the medical wing Lance expanded, and the workshop Apollo has overfilled, and the trading posts where all 5 of them do their work, is, by any structural assessment, not permanent. It is well maintained and well managed and as secure as its environment permits. But it exists in a world where the arc is still active, where the surface above is still hostile, where the conditions that created the need for the hub have not resolved and show no current signs of resolving. The permanence of the hub is not a structural permanence. It is a commitment permanence, the permanence of 5 people who have decided that this is where they are and what they are doing, and who apply to that decision the same sustained, disciplined, principled attention that they apply to everything else. That is a form of permanence. It is the only form available. It turns out to be enough. What makes the hub remarkable is not any single feature, but the accumulation of features, the material sourcing and the weapons expertise, and the precision ammunition and the adaptive technology and the medical capability, all present, all maintained, all available to the people who need them. The probability that all 5 of these capabilities would be present in the same place, in the hands of 5 people who are each excellent at what they do, and who are each committed to the fair deployment of that excellence in the service of the people around them, is not high. It is the kind of coincidence that people in less rational moods call fate. The more rational explanation is that functional things attract the people who value function, and that the hub's functionality, which started with Celeste and was extended by each subsequent arrival, was itself the attractor. Excellence draws excellence. Commitment draws commitment. The hub became what it is, partly because of who built it, and partly because of what it became, and what it became drew more of the same. This is not magic. It is, in Celeste's terms, a system working as designed. The traders have talked in various configurations and at various times about what the hub is for in a larger sense. Not the immediate operational purpose of supporting raider survival, which is clear and agreed upon, but the longer horizon purpose, the one that justifies the current costs in terms of the future they are building toward. These conversations are rare, and they are not resolved in the way that conversations between precise, analytical people prefer to be resolved, with a definitive conclusion that can be written down and referred to. The conversations end, instead, with a kind of provisional agreement that the direction is right, even though the destination is not fully specified, and that the appropriate response to an unspecified destination is continued movement in the right direction while continuing to assess the destination question. This is in its way characteristic of all of them. The commitment to action in the absence of complete information, the trust in the process when the outcome cannot be guaranteed. They have all been doing this since the beginning. They are still doing it. The thing the hub represents, the specific thing, beyond the material and tactical and medical support, is the proposition that after everything is taken, the choice of what to do with what remains is still available. The Ark took almost everything. It took the infrastructure and the supply chains and the institutions and the social fabric and the specific textures of the lives that were being lived and will not be lived in the same way again. It did not take the traders. It did not take what they knew or what they were capable of or the specific quality of attention they brought to the work of survival and what they built from what was not taken. The hub, the network, the culture of fair exchange and honest information and principled care is the argument that remains is enough. Not enough to restore what was lost. That is not available, but enough to build something that is worth having, worth protecting, worth the daily cost of commitment. That argument, demonstrated in the daily operation of the hub, is the trader's most significant contribution to the post-Ark world. More significant than any specific trade, any specific exchange, any specific survival that can be attributed to their work, it is the argument that it is worth continuing, made not in words, but in the work, made every day. The relationship the traders have with time is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of their collective character. They do not speak about the future in the way that pre-Ark people spoke about the future, with the confident assumptions of infrastructure and continuity and the reasonable expectation that next year would exist and would resemble this year in its fundamental operating conditions. They speak about the future in the way of people who know that the future is contingent and whose contingency plans are actual plans rather than rhetorical gestures. But they speak about it. They plan. Celeste projects material availability over extended time windows. Shaunie develops threat assessments with long-range forecasting components. Tanwen is working on technical problems whose solutions are years away. Apollo has design concepts that he expects will not be realizable for an extended period. Lance is building a medical knowledge base whose full value will only be apparent when it is complete enough to draw longitudinal conclusions. All of them are investing in futures that are not guaranteed. This investment, the commitment of present effort to future returns that might not arrive, is one of the definitions of hope. They would not use the word. The behavior is undeniable. Chapter 7. The Ark. What the traders know and what they fear. No one at the hub knows more about the Ark collectively than the traders do, and the traders know this, which gives their understanding of the Ark a particular quality of weight, the weight of people who are aware that they are working at the frontier of available knowledge, that the information they have is more than most, but is still radically incomplete relative to what the question requires, and that the incompleteness has operational consequences they cannot fully compensate for. They know what the Ark does in considerable technical detail through the combined expertise of 5 people who study it from 5 different angles. They do not know why. And the why, the question of purpose, of origin, of the intention behind the machines, is the question that sits beneath all of the operational knowledge, unresolved and unresolvable with the evidence currently available. And that colors everything the traders understand about their situation, with an uncertainty that no amount of surface mapping, or weapons analysis, or medical documentation fully dispels. Celeste's contribution to the hub's Ark knowledge is the most granular and the most material. She knows what the Ark are made of, to the level of chemical composition and alloy structure and energy compound formulation, in more detail than any other person in the underground world, and possibly than any human alive. Her analysis has produced a profile of Ark material properties that covers the known types of Ark units and the known types of Ark structures, and that identifies, with the precision of a trained materials scientist working at the edge of her field, properties that have no precedent in human manufacturing. The absence of precedent is not, she is careful to note in her documentation, equivalent to impossibility. The history of materials science is the history of humans discovering properties that were not previously known and manufacturing materials that previously did not exist. But the specific combination of properties she has documented in Ark materials suggests an engineering sophistication that, by her careful, evidence-based assessment, exceeds humanity's pre-Ark peak by a significant margin. She documents this without sensationalism. The documentation is sensational anyway. Shaunie's knowledge of the Ark is tactical and behavioral. She knows what they do in the specific detail of someone who has been observing, mapping, and analyzing their operational patterns for years. She knows their formation logic, the way they arrange themselves relative to each other and to environmental features, the patterns that indicate concentration rather than patrol, the behaviors that precede specific forms of engagement. She knows their engagement protocols, which are consistent enough to be predictable in aggregate and variable enough at the individual unit level to require continuous monitoring rather than static assessment. She has developed a notation system for Ark behavioral patterns that is now used across the hub's surface operations. And the language of this system, the specific designations for the Ark behaviors she has observed, has become part of the hub's standard operational vocabulary. She knows more about how they fight than anyone. She is also the first to note that her knowledge, comprehensive as it is a model of current behavior that the Ark have shown the capacity to adapt away from, slowly but demonstrably, over the period she has been observing them. Tanwen's knowledge of the Ark is technical and compositional in a way that overlaps with Celeste's on the material side and with Shaunie's on the weapons side, but is distinct from both. He knows what the Ark's systems do in terms of the physical processes involved, the energy generation, the propulsion, the weapons discharge, the sensing and communication, at a level of technical specificity that nobody else at the hub matches. His analysis of Ark energy compounds is particularly advanced because energy is the interface between the material and the functional. It is what the materials do, what they become when they are put in motion, what makes a machine rather than a sculpture. He has characterized several Ark energy discharge types with enough precision to allow Apollo's countermeasure development to target specific aspects of the discharge process. And this characterization has had measurable tactical consequences for raiders who carry Apollo's countermeasures into the relevant zone types. The characterization is ongoing. The Ark energy systems have properties he has not yet fully mapped, and the mapping requires access to operating Ark systems rather than to wreckage, which presents obvious and significant practical challenges. Apollo's knowledge of the Ark is that of an engineer looking at another engineer's work, the specific focused attention of someone who is trying to understand the design logic of a system in order to work around it, subvert it, and ultimately turn its properties against it. He is interested in the arc in the way that people are interested in problems that are exactly hard enough to be interesting. Hard enough that the solution is not obvious, easy enough that the solution is not impossible, specific enough that progress is possible and visible. He has a theory about the internal logic of arc design, the principles that govern which units are deployed in which combinations, the functional differentiation between unit types, the apparent prioritization rules that determine arc response to different types of interference. The theory is not proven, it is testable, and he tests it through his countermeasure and gadget design and through the field feedback that raiders bring back about how his devices interact with specific arc configurations. The tests refine the theory improves the devices improve raider outcomes. The cycle continues. Lance's knowledge of the arc is the most intimate and the most terrible. He knows what they do to human bodies. In the clinical specificity of someone who has treated every form of arc-inflicted injury that raiders have survived, and some that they nearly did not, he knows the mechanisms of arc-energy weapon damage to human tissue, the specific pathophysiology, the injury patterns, the secondary effects that develop in the hours and days after initial exposure, the long-term consequences of exposure to arc energy fields that fall below the threshold of acute injury but accumulate over repeated exposures. He knows this the way pathologists know disease, through the cases, through the tissue, through the data that the human body yields under professional examination. It is not a comfortable form of knowledge. It is necessary knowledge. He produces it and applies it in the service of keeping people alive, and the application matters more to him than the comfort. The question of arc origin, where they came from, who or what made them, what their purpose is one that the traders discuss more rarely and more carefully than most topics, because it sits at the intersection of what the evidence supports and what the evidence cannot yet reach. The material evidence suggests extraterrestrial manufacture. The behavioral evidence suggests purposive organization of a complexity that implies something like intelligence. The pattern evidence, the observation that arc activity is not random but organized according to principles that appear consistent over time, suggests coordination at a scale and sophistication that goes beyond simple machine operation. None of these observations, individually or collectively, resolves the origin question. They constrain the answer space without eliminating the uncertainty that remains. The traders live in this uncertainty with varying degrees of comfort. Celeste treats it as an open research question requiring more data. Shaunie treats it as a strategic variable that affects threat modeling. Tanwen treats it as the most technically interesting unsolved problem of his career. Apollo treats it as a design question about an unknown designer. And Lance treats it as context for understanding the nature of the threat to human survival without finding the origin personally meaningful beyond that context. The arc's apparent lack of interest in negotiation or communication, the absence, in any observed encounter, of behavior that could be interpreted as communicative in the human sense, is a fact that all 5 traders have noted, and that each interprets differently. Celeste views it as consistent with a purely functional system that has no purpose that communication would serve. Shaunie views it as strategically significant because an adversary that cannot be communicated with cannot be deterred, and deterrence is the most resource-efficient form of security. Tanwen views it as an engineering constraint. If the machines are purely automated, the absence of communication is simply the absence of a feature that was not designed in. Apollo views it as the most interesting question of all, because any sufficiently complex system develops something that looks like communication at some level, even if not at the human interface level, and the question of where the arc communication exists is one he is genuinely curious about. Lance views it with a clinical pragmatism. If they cannot communicate, the only intervention available is physical, and the physical interventions are what he is preparing for. The fear that the traders have about the arc, the specific operational fear beyond the general danger of the surface environment, is the fear of escalation, the observation that arc behavior has changed over the period the hub has been operational, in ways that suggest adaptation to human presence and resistance. The changes are small in absolute terms and significant in trend. New arc unit types have appeared that were not present in the early period. Established arc tactical patterns have evolved in ways that specifically reduce the effectiveness of countermeasures that worked previously. Zone coverage has expanded in directions that follow, with some consistency, the directions in which raiding activity has developed. None of this is proof of a directed anti-human campaign in the way that human military escalation would be directed, but it is evidence of a system that is not static, that responds to its environment in ways that change the environment for the humans navigating it. And the direction of change in every observable dimension is toward greater difficulty for human surface operations. The traders know this. It is the thread of concern that underlies all of their planning for the future. The most frightening single piece of ARC knowledge in the hub's information base is not widely shared, because the people who hold it, primarily the 5 traders, with input from a small number of technical specialists, have determined that its unrestricted distribution would create more harm through anxiety and misinterpretation than through the informed operational adjustments it enables. What it indicates is that the pattern of ARC activity mapped over the full period of observation at the appropriate scale shows a concentration gradient moving toward the hub's region, not toward the hub specifically. The ARC do not appear to have located the hub, which is its own ongoing security project managed by Shaunie with characteristic thoroughness, but toward the region in the way that a tide is toward the shore, gradually, with fluctuations, but consistently in one direction. What this means operationally is that the window during which the hub's current location is viable is not indefinite. Celeste has been mapping alternative sites. Shaunie has been developing contingency extraction and relocation protocols. Tanwen is optimizing his process for rapid equipment transport. Apollo is designing a compact version of his most critical gadget lines for mobility. Lance is preparing a triage version of his supply chain for a transition period. They are all, quietly and without announcement, preparing for the possibility that the hub as it currently exists may need to become something else. The preparation is ongoing. The timeline is unknown. The commitment to continuation is absolute. The ARC, in the end, is not the whole story. It is the context, the threat that shaped the need for the hub and the need for the traders, and the need for everything the traders have built. But the story is not about the ARC. The story is about what the humans did in response to the ARC, and specifically about what these 5 humans did in this place with what they had. The ARC provided the pressure. The traders provided the response. And the response, everything described in the preceding chapters, the materials and the weapons and the ammunition and the gadgets and the medicine and the hub and the culture and the economics of fair exchange and the commitment to the people who go topside and come back, is not small. It is, in the circumstances, extraordinary, not because the traders are extraordinary people, in the sense of people with exceptional supernatural gifts, but because they are excellent people who made excellent choices under the worst available conditions and sustained those choices through years of pressure that would have eroded the choices of less committed people. That is the real story. That is what the lore of the ARC Raiders traders is, underneath all of the specific details of what each of them does and who each of them was and how each of them arrived. It is a story about the choice that is still available after everything else has been taken. The choice of what to do with what remains. They chose well. They are still choosing. The raids continue. Chapter 8. The Raiders, the people the traders serve. It would be easy, in a narrative focused on the traders, to let the raiders exist as background, as a population that the traders serve, referenced but not examined, present in the aggregate without being present as individuals. This would be an error. The traders are who they are, partly because of who the raiders are, because the specific qualities of the population they serve have shaped the specific forms their service takes, and because the relationship between the traders and the raiders is not a simple provider-client relationship, but a mutual one, defined by what each group has given the other over time. The traders made the hub into what it is. The raiders made the traders into what they are. The shaping has gone both ways. Raiders are defined by a specific form of courage that is different from the courage of soldiers, or the courage of emergency responders, or any of the other pre-ARC categories that surface work superficially resembles. It is not the courage of duty, in the sense of a formal obligation that must be fulfilled regardless of personal preference. It is not the courage of necessity in the purest sense, because while the surface runs produce resources that the hub needs, individual raiders make choices about when and whether and where to go that exceed the minimum necessity. It is closer to the courage of chosen risk, the deliberate engagement with a dangerous environment that people who do it consistently describe not as the absence of fear, but as the management of fear in the service of a purpose they have decided is worth the fear. The traders see this courage every day, across the trading posts, in the faces of people who are preparing to go, or who have just returned, and the traders' respect for it, unspoken in most cases, but operationally expressed in the quality of what they provide, is one of the deep currents of the hub's culture. Celeste sees the raiders as she sees most things, through the lens of the material they bring back and the information they provide about the surface conditions that produced it. But she has been watching raiders for long enough that she has developed, without fully acknowledging it, a secondary observation channel that tracks them as people rather than as transaction partners. She notices who is going out more than usual and what that frequency implies about their situation. She notices who brings back unusual materials and what the unusual nature of those materials implies about where they were and what they were doing. She notices the subtle changes in the character of what a raider delivers over time, changes in zone preference, in material selection, in the condition of what they return with, that sometimes signal something worth paying attention to. She does not act on these observations overtly, but occasionally, in the margins of a transaction, there is a question: how is the northern axis treating you this period? Is the eastern quadrant showing the same degradation pattern you reported last time? That is more specific than an inventory assessment requires, and that a raider who is paying attention recognizes as something other than purely commercial interest. Shaunie's relationship with specific raiders develops through the tactical dimension. She knows who is going to what zone, what they are likely to face there, and therefore what they need in the way of weapons and information. Over time, this knowledge becomes cumulative and specific. She builds a tactical profile of each regular raider that incorporates their history of encounters, their demonstrated capabilities, their preferred operational approaches, their specific weaknesses, and specific strengths. She does not show this profile to the raiders themselves, partly because its format would be uncomfortable for most people to encounter, and partly because the purpose of the profile is to serve them better rather than to demonstrate how thoroughly she has been paying attention. But the quality of the match she makes between a raider's specific profile and their specific equipment needs is, for regular traders, noticeably different from the quality of assessment for newcomers. The regulars feel this difference without necessarily knowing its source. They feel, in her transactions, that they are being seen, not in the warm, affirming sense, but in the precise sense of someone who knows what they are capable of and equips them accordingly. For most of them, this is enough. The injured raiders who pass through Lance's care occupy a particular place in the hub's social fabric. They are the evidence of what the surface does to people, present in the medical wing where others can observe them. And the quality of what is possible to do about that evidence is itself evidence of something else, of the hub's capacity to respond, to repair, to return people to function. The sight of someone who should not be walking, of someone who came back wrong being made more right by Lance's work, is not incidental to the hub's culture. It is one of its most important texts. It tells the people watching it what is possible. It tells them that the surface is survivable not just in the sense of survival by luck, but in the sense of survival by intention, because there are people here who know what to do about the worst things the surface can send you back with, and who will do it. Apollo's relationship with raiders is the most informal of the 5 traders and the most bidirectional in a creative sense. He learns from them, from the specific field feedback they provide about the performance of his devices in actual surface conditions, which he treats as primary data that his workshop testing cannot replicate. He has an ongoing informal feedback arrangement with a rotating group of experienced raiders who he trusts to observe and report accurately, and the quality of his device iteration is directly dependent on the quality of their feedback. The arrangement is not formalized and is not monetized. They are compensated through early access to new devices and through the occasional custom design that addresses a specific need they have identified, rather than through any explicit payment structure. It is the closest thing Apollo has to a collaborative relationship in the formal sense, and the products of the collaboration, devices that perform better than anything he could have designed from workshop testing alone, justify both parties' investment in it. Tianwen's relationship with raiders is the most information-dense and the most likely to be remembered by the raiders as educational. The briefings he provides before handing over ammunition are for raiders who engage with them fully, genuinely instructive, not just about the specific load they are taking out, but about the underlying principles of ballistic performance in variable conditions, about what to observe in field encounters that will help him improve his loads, about the physical logic of why a specific arc unit type requires a specific approach, and what happens to that approach when conditions change.